The wind screamed down from the mesa, thick with smoke and the crackle of fire sweeping across the vast prairie. A lone barn stood silent under the pale moon, roof shaking in the gusts. From inside came the desperate screams of a horse. The tall woman woke to smoke seeping under her door. She burst barefoot into the yard, nightdress flapping wildly. The barn door was barred shut from the outside with a crude plank. Flames licked the dry walls, rising fast. She sprinted forward and ripped the plank away with bare hands. Splinters bit deep into her palms. The horse shrieked louder, fire popping, wind howling stronger now. Who had barred it? Why tonight? Heat burned her face, smoke choked her lungs. Yet she charged into the black, suffocating smoke of the burning barn, reaching for the horse as the roof timbers began to crack and collapse overhead. The wind came first. It always did. It came down off the mesa before the sun did, before the roosters, before anything else in the territory had the sense to be awake. Delphine Voss stood in it, feet planted, arms crossed. Her shadow fell across the whole width of the corral fence, and past it, and into the dust beyond. Long as a felled tree, she was not born this size. That was the thing people forgot, or maybe never knew, or maybe just didn't care to remember once they'd already decided what she was. She had been an ordinary baby once, small enough to fit in her mother's 2 hands, and then she had grown, and kept growing. Until by the time she was 17, she stood taller than every man in 3 counties, and by the time she was 20 she'd stopped counting how many door frames she'd cracked her skull against. 7 feet. Give or take an inch, nobody had ever bothered to measure exactly, because who owned a tape long enough, flaught, and who would ask her to stand still for it? She split a log in half with one swing of the axe. The crack of it rolled out over the flat land like a gunshot, and somewhere off past the rise a dog barked twice and went quiet again, like even the dog knew better than to keep complaining about it. Amos used to say she hit like God's own hammer. He used to say it laughing, not scared, and that was the thing about Amos. He was never scared of her. Not once. Not the first time he saw her scum come striding across the churchyard with her sleeves rolled up. Not the night he asked her to marry him, with his neck craned back so far to look at her face that she'd worried he'd tip right over. He'd been gone 8 months now. Fever took him in November. Took him fast, the way fever does when it means business. 3 days from the first cough to the last breath, and she had held his hand the whole time, and his hand had looked so small in hers. That was the part that undid her afterward, in the nights when the undoing came. Not the fever, not the fear on his face near the end, his hand, small in hers. The way it had always been, and the way she had never once minded, because a big hand was made for holding a small one careful. She split another log, because that was what a person did. When the grief came up like water in a well that shouldn't have any, you didn't sit down in it. You picked up the axe. You split the wood. You fed the horse. You did the next thing, and then the thing after that, until the sun went down, and you'd built yourself a wall of small chores tall enough to hide behind, which was its own kind of strange, she thought sometimes, hiding behind a wall of chores. When she herself was the tallest thing on this stretch of prairie for 10 miles in any direction, and there wasn't a wall built yet that could actually hide her from anybody's eyes, they looked. They always looked. In town, at the mercantile, at church on the Sundays she still bothered to go. Children stared with their mouths open, and their mothers yanked them by the collar, and hissed, "Don't stare, it's rude." Which of course meant the child now knew for certain that this was a thing worth staring at. A thing so remarkable it had its own rule against looking. Delphine had stopped minding the children years ago. It was the grown men who bothered her, the ones who looked away too fast, the ones who crossed the street. Cole called her Mrs. Voss in a voice, pitched careful, and even like they were talking to something that might spook. Amos never talked to her like that. Amos talked to her like she was just a woman, a tall one. That was all. She missed being talked to like that so much. Some mornings it felt like a hand closing around her throat. She set the axe down, wiped her forehead with her forearm, looked out at the horse pen, where Samson stood swishing flies with his tail. A horse built along the same enormous lines as she was. 17 hands of black Belgian muscle, that she'd bought off a freighting outfit 2 years back. Because no ordinary saddle horse could carry her weight further than a mile without suffering for it. Samson didn't suffer. Samson looked most days like he enjoyed the work. But Samson wasn't the horse she was looking for. The pen beside his was empty, had been empty 3 days now. And the rope that should have held Jasper, her second horse, the sorrel, gelding Amos, had broken and gentled himself the spring before he died, hung loose and chewed through against the rail, snapped clean by a storm that had come screaming down off the mesa on Tuesday night, and hadn't let up till near dawn. Jasper had bolted. Of course he had. He always bolted west when the wind came from the east, because that fool horse had some backwards sense of direction bred into him that made him walk straight into whatever was already trying to knock him down. She'd told herself Tuesday night, he'll turn up. He'll wander back hungry by morning. He hadn't. Wednesday, she told herself. Give it another day. He hadn't. And now it was Thursday, and a horse was not a small thing to lose. A horse was not sentiment. A horse was the difference between a plowed field come September and a winter spent watching her own ribs through her nightgown. She had exactly 2 horses and 1 cow and 40 acres, and a debt to the bank that Amos had taken out to buy seed the spring he died. A debt she was paying down 1 egg and 1 bushel at a time. And she did not have room in that arithmetic to lose a horse to the wind and her own procrastination. So she would ride out today. Before the sun got too high and burned the tracks off the ground, she saddled Samson herself, which took some doing, because Samson stood a full 2 hands taller than any horse she'd broken before him, and she'd had to build a mounting platform out of an old feed crate just to reach the stirrup without hauling herself up like she was climbing a barn wall. She'd built the platform the same week she buried Amos. Hadn't thought about the timing of that until just now, standing on it, 1 boot already in the stirrup, which was a strange thing to notice. That grief made you build things, platforms, walls of chores, whole architectures of survival, put up plank by plank without ever once deciding to do it on purpose. She swung up, settled her weight, which took Samson a half-second, longer to absorb than it would have taken a smaller horse. And then he steadied, the way he always did, patient as a mountain deciding to hold still. "All right," she said to him. Her voice came out low, worn soft at the edges, the voice of a woman who spent most of her days talking to a horse and a cow, and could decay to a grave marker on the hill, because there wasn't a great deal of anybody else left to talk to. "Let's go find that fool of a horse before he gets himself killed." Samson flicked 1 ear back at her. Didn't argue. She rode west. Because the wind had come from the east, and Jasper always walked into the wind like he had a score to settle with it, and there was some comfort in that at least. In knowing one true fact about a fool animal's fool logic, she rode past the fence line Amos had strung the summer they married, past the dry creek bed that only ran in March, past the boundary marker that was really just a cairn of stacked stones, because nobody out here had ever bothered with survey pins. And somewhere past that cairn, without meaning to, without even noticing the exact moment it happened, she crossed onto land that was not hers. She knew whose land it was. Everybody knew whose land this was. You could ride 2 days in any direction out here and still be inside the reach of Nanton Cole's cattle, and there wasn't a soul in the territory who hadn't heard the stories. Half of them true, and half of them stretched taller than she was. They said he'd built his herd from nothing. Started with land his own family had held through years of fighting off men who wanted it gone, and had grown it acre by acre, dollar by dollar, until he ran more cattle than any 3 outfits combined. They said he didn't talk more than he had to. They said he'd buried a wife and a son, years back, and hadn't been the same man since, though nobody agreed on what he'd been like before. They said he was hard. They said he was fair, which out here were not always the same thing and sometimes were opposites. They said a lot of things. Delphine had never met him she was about. 2. The land dipped down into a shallow draw thick with mesquite and cottonwood, silver-leafed and rattling faint in the wind, and it was there, in the bottom of it, that she saw a flash of sorrel through the brush. Jasper, thinner than he should have been, a scrape down his flank crusted, dark, but alive, and hers, and standing dead still in the middle of a scene that made the hair go up on the back of Delphine's neck, before her mind had even finished putting words to why. Because he wasn't alone. 3 horses stood with him, and they were not range stock, not the sun-bleached Mustangs that drifted up from Mexico some springs. These were fine animals, a blood bay mare with a white star between her eyes, favoring one leg, a gray gelding deep through the chest, a dark stain of dried blood matted into his shoulder, and a young chestnut stud, narrow-hipped, wild-eyed, who threw his head up the second. Delphine's shadow crossed the ridge and showed her the whites of his eyes like she was already the worst thing that had ever happened to him. She sat Samson very still, because she understood, in the space of about 2 seconds, exactly what this looked like: a woman, on land that wasn't hers, with 3 horses that weren't hers, standing docile enough beside a 4th horse that was. No rope on any of them yet. No story ready to explain it. Out here, a woman could hang for less. She'd heard the stories about that too. She thought about turning around, about riding home and pretending she'd never seen it, letting Jasper's lost one more day, while she worked out a plan that didn't involve trespassing on Nanton Cole's grass, with his bleeding horses standing around her like she'd rustled them herself. Except the gray was bleeding, not the kind of bleeding that killed a horse in an hour. The kind that killed him in a week slow, if the wound went bad and nobody cleaned it. And the chestnut was holding his off hind foot wrong, barely touching it to the ground. And Jasper, fool, ungainly, wind-chasing Jasper, was standing in the middle of the 3 of them, with his ears pricked toward her and a look on his face that said, as plain as if he'd spoken it, "You took your time." So she got down off Samson, slow, both hands where the horses could see them. "Easy," she said, low. The way her mother had taught her to talk to anything frightened, human or animal, made no difference. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The chestnut danced back 2 steps, snorted, settled. The gray watched her with the flat patience of something that had already decided. Pain was coming no matter what it did about it. She got a hand on Jasper's neck first, felt him lean his whole heavy head into her shoulder and blow warm grass-smelling breath down the back of her collar, and, for 1 second, just one, she let herself close her eyes and lean back into him. Then she straightened. Because there was work to do, and the light was already getting long, she had 1 lead rope. She was working her own kerchief loose to fashion a second one when she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming down the far ridge at a hard, controlled trot. A man's voice, pitched low enough that it didn't need to be loud to carry. Step away from those horses. She did not turn around right away. She finished her knot first. Because a woman who spun around startled was a woman who looked guilty. And she was not guilty, and she was not going to act like it. Then she turned. He came down off the rise with the sun behind him, so for a moment he was only a shape. Big man, broad through the shoulders, flat-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle laid across his thighs, not aimed at her, not yet. His horse was black as a crow's wing and moved like it knew exactly what it was doing. As he came closer, the sun slid off him, and she saw his face properly. Weathered dark from a life spent outdoors, sharp-boned. 36 years old if the stories had it right, though he carried himself like a man who'd lived through more than 36 years worth of trouble. His eyes were black and unreadable, and they went over her, all of her, the whole considerable height of her standing there in his draw, with 3 of his horses and 1 of hers, without so much as a flicker of the surprise she'd learned to expect and brace against. That, of all things, was what caught her off guard. Not the rifle. The lack of a flinch. He swung down off the black horse, walked toward her without hurrying, stopped about 6 feet off, close enough to talk, far enough to still be careful, and she understood that distance for exactly what it was. "I'm not stealing your horses," she said. "Didn't say you were." Your voice said it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Gone before it finished forming. My horse went missing 3 days ago," she said. He looked at Jasper, looked at the gray, and his jaw went tight at the sight of the wound. Looked at the chestnut, and something sharper crossed his face. "That stud's been missing 2 weeks," he said. "Then you can thank my horse for keeping him company." This time the almost smile nearly finished itself. He covered it by turning his head and spitting into the sand. Who Delphine Voss? The Voss place, east of the dry wash. My husband bought it off a man named Pruitt, Amos Voss. You knew him? I knew of him. A pause. Heard he died, fever. Last November, he was quiet a moment. Took his hat off, ran a hand back through hair black as his horse, put the hat back on. And when he did, his whole face had rearranged itself into something more guarded than it had been a second before. Sorry for your loss, Mrs. Voss. Thank you. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that hadn't already worn itself thin from repeating. How have you been managing? Out there alone? I've been managing. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way people rarely let themselves do, taking in the sunburn, across her nose, the loose strand of hair she hadn't bothered pinning back, the patched elbow of her riding coat, and she watched him do it and braced for it out of 8 sheer scale of her, standing there a full head and shoulders past where a woman was supposed to stop. He didn't say anything about it. Didn't look away too fast, either. Just looked. The way he might look at a horse he was deciding whether he could trust, and then he was done looking. And it was over, and nothing about his face had changed. Nobody had looked at her like that since Amos. Your gray's got a wound needs cleaning, she said, because she needed something to say that wasn't about the way he'd looked at her. And your chestnut's favoring that hind foot bad. I don't know what happened out here, but it wasn't nothing. Coyotes, maybe. Coyotes would have spooked my horse into next week. He'd have made noise. He makes noise about most things, I'd guess. He has opinions. I can see that. He walked past her, close enough that she caught the smell of leather and wood smoke off his coat, and crouched down beside the gray gelding. Laid one hand flat against the horse's neck. The gray dropped his head straight into the man's palm, and let out a long breath, the kind of breath a horse only gave up to somebody it trusted all the way down. She hadn't expected that. This hard-closed, ice-eyed man, crouched in the dirt, with his hand cupped soft around a wounded animal's face. I can clean that, she said before she'd finished deciding to say it. I've got Yarrow at the house. And honey, he needs both, and he needs them today, or it'll go bad on him. He looked up at her without standing. I've got men at the ranch who can see to it. Your ranch is 4 miles north. My place is half that, east. And I don't know what your men know about wound care. But I know what I know. He stood, slow, unfolding his full height, which put him almost eye to eye with her. Rare enough thing that she felt it land somewhere behind her ribs. The strange, unfamiliar sensation of being looked at level instead of up or down. He studied her for a long moment. She made herself hold still under it. Made herself not look away first. All right, Mrs. Voss. He said it like a man setting down something heavy and deciding, against his own better judgment, to trust the ground to hold it. Lead on. They walked the horses out of the draw together, him leading the chestnut and the bay, her with Jasper and the gray. Samson trailing behind them on a long rein like a black mountain that had decided to come along for the company. They didn't talk much. He asked once how far, she told him. He asked once if she had children. No, she said. Not anymore. He didn't ask what she meant by anymore. She was grateful for that, in a way that surprised her, a small, hot gratitude that caught in her throat before she could examine it too closely. Her place came into view as they came up over the last swell of ground, the low soddy roof, the barn, leaning a few degrees further than it had any business leaning. The kitchen garden she'd been losing a slow war against the grasshoppers since May. She watched him take it in, watched his face stay flat and unreadable while he did it. She did not apologize for the size of it. She had stopped apologizing for what she had a long time ago. Back before Amos even. Back. When she was 17, and had finally understood that the world was not going to shrink itself down to a size that made other people comfortable, and neither was she. She got the gray settled in the shade by the well. Went inside, for her tin of yarrow and her honey crock, the good one, the one she kept on the top shelf, because it was the most valuable thing left in the house. When she came back out, he'd already shed his coat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and he was running a hand down the gray's foreleg with the slow, careful patience of a man checking for something he already half suspected he'd find. His forearms were dark, corded with old scars, the kind a man only earned from years of work that didn't forgive mistakes. "Hold him," she said. He held him. She washed the wound with water, warmed over the fire, picked grit out of it with her fingers, and then a splinter of mesquite thorn, as long as her thumbnail, which she held up without a word, so he could see it before she set it aside. She crushed the yarrow in her palm, a big palm, big enough to crush a whole handful at once, and packed it into the cleaned flesh, and over that she smeared a thin layer of honey, careful the way her mother had shown her. The gray stood for it, flinched twice. Both times, the man murmured something low to him that she couldn't quite catch, and both times the horse steadied. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked my mother. She was a granny woman, a midwife back in Missouri before we came west. She didn't look up from her work. "Skin's skin," she used to say. "Doesn't matter whose." Sensible woman, she was. A pause, and then, because the quiet between them had gone somewhere she wasn't ready for, she asked, "And your name?" "I never got it, Cole." "Nanton Cole." She looked up at that, because she had heard the name Cole plenty of times in town, always attached to some story bigger than the last one. And she had pictured, she realized now, a little ashamed of it. Someone older, someone colder. Not a man crouched in her yard with honey on his fingers, gentling a frightened horse like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're the one they talk about," she said. "The whole territory, near enough. People talk. They say you don't." Almost the smile. Again. Gone again. Before it landed. "Not when there's nothing worth saying." She tied off the bandage, stepped back to look at her work, and it was good work, clean and tight, and she let herself feel that. Just for a moment, just long to notice it, before she moved on to the chestnut. The stud didn't want to be touched. He danced sideways, showed teeth, rolled his eye white and wild, and Cole stepped forward with one hand half raised. "Let me," Delphine said. "He's not gentle. Nearly took a man's arm off last spring. He's not mean. He's scared. Those aren't the same animal." She walked toward him slow, hand out flat, eyes down, and she started to hum, low, wordless. An old tune her mother used to hum, over feverish babies, over spooked mules, over anything trembling too hard to be reasoned with in words. The chestnut's ears flicked toward the sound. He held still. She got a hand on his neck, slid it down his shoulder, kept humming the whole time, and ran her palm down the off hind leg until she found the hot swelling above the fetlock. She pressed, gently. He didn't strike. She lifted the hoof, a stone wedged hard against the frog, and she worked it free with the point of her knife and set the hoof back down and stepped away. "He'll be sore a week," she said, "but he'll be sound." When she turned around, Cole was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that had cracked open just slightly behind his eyes and hadn't closed back up yet. "What?" she said. "Nothing. It's not nothing." He was quiet a second. "I was going to put that horse down if we couldn't gentle him. Bought him off a man who'd near ruined him for good. I figured he was done. He's not done. He's just scared." "Yeah," Cole said, and he wasn't looking at the chestnut when he said it. "I see that now." It was later, standing by the well with 2 tin cups of coffee she hadn't quite meant to offer, that the wrongness of the whole afternoon finally settled into words between them. "Those wounds," Delphine said. "The gray. That thorn was driven in deep. Deeper than a horse gets from just running scared through brush." Cole didn't answer right away. He was looking off west, toward the draw, toward the ravine where she'd found them, and something in his stillness had changed. Gone sharper, more careful, like a man listening for a sound he already half expected to hear again. "3 horses," he said slowly. "All from different pastures, all ending up in the same draw, 2 miles off my nearest fence line. Could have wandered there together. Could have." He didn't sound like he believed it. "You think somebody drove them?" "I think somebody drove them." His jaw worked once, tight. "And I think whoever did it wanted them found, together, on the wrong side of a fence line, with a story already halfway built around them before anybody rode out to look." Delphine felt something cold move down through her, slow, because she understood exactly what he meant before he finished saying it. 3 horses, herded into a draw. left to be discovered by whoever came looking. By her, as it happened, riding out after her own lost horse, wandering unknowing onto land that wasn't hers, standing over 3 bleeding animals that weren't hers either. "If I hadn't come along," she said slowly. "If your own men had found them here, strange horses, in a draw, off your land, they'd have said rustlers were working the county line." He looked at her. "And they'd have had 3 bleeding horses and a missing widow's horse for proof. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud. Neither of them needed to. He made him stay for coffee before he rode off with his horses trailing behind him, though made was too strong a word for how it happened. She heard herself say there's coffee, and heard him say I'll take some, and it was done before either of them had properly decided anything. He drank half the cup in one swallow, looking out over her thin kitchen garden at the long gold light coming down over the grass. "You've got a fence to mend," he said. "Not unkind. Just noticing, I've got a lot of things to mend. How are you going to make it through winter, Mrs. Voss?" "I'll make it. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I've got." He nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood better than most, and he set the cup down on the well post and looked at her for a moment that went on a beat too long to be nothing. "I'll send a man out," he said. "Look at that barn door before it comes off its hinge altogether. I don't need charity, Mr. Cole, wasn't offering any. A man drives 3 of my horses onto your land to build a story against one of us. Could be you, could be me, could be both, if whoever's behind it is patient enough." His eyes had gone hard again, the guarded look from earlier, settling back over his face like a door swinging shut. "I look out for what's mine. Right now, that includes finding out who thinks they can use your fence line to hurt either one of us." She didn't have an answer ready for that. Didn't entirely trust the warmth that moved through her at hearing herself folded in, however briefly, however strangely, into the list of things a man like that considered worth looking out for. He rode off west with his 3 horses trailing, and the black horse's hooves kicked up dust that hung gold in the last of the light. And Delphine stood by her own well and watched until the rise swallowed him from view. Only then did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Boyd Larkin showed up 2 days later. He was a lean man, maybe 50, with a face that had spent 40 of those years squinting into weather, and he tipped his hat to her before he'd even swung down off his horse. "Mr. Cole sent me to look at that barn door, ma'am. Said it was leaning." "It's leaning," she agreed. "Has been for a while. Won't take but an hour. It took 3. He fixed the door, straightened a hinge on the shutter that hadn't closed right since the winter, looked at the well rope and shook his head and said he'd send out to one before the week was through. And the whole time he worked, he kept up an easy, unhurried talk about nothing much. The weather, the state of the grass. A colt that had gotten loose from the Cole herd the month before and led 3 men on a chase clear to the county line. When he was finished, he stood by his horse a moment, looking at her with the particular directness of an older man who'd decided he had something worth saying, and intended to say it before he left. "He's a good man, ma'am," Larkin said. "Mr. Cole. I've ridden for him 11 years. Would ride for him 11 more if he'd have me." "I don't doubt it. I just thought you ought to know it. Some folks in town will tell you different things about him. Most of it's talk that never got within a mile of the truth." She thought about that for a long time after he'd ridden off. Thought about why a foreman would ride 4 miles out of his way to tell a stranger her employer was a good man, unasked, unprompted. Like it mattered to him personally that she know it. The trouble arrived on a Saturday. She was in the garden, sleeves rolled, dirt to the elbow, fighting the same losing war against the grasshoppers, when she heard a buggy coming up the wagon track. A fine buggy, black lacquer gleaming even under a coat of trail dust, pulled by a matched pair that had never once in their lives pulled a plow. The man who climbed down from it wore a coat cut sharper than anything she'd seen since she left Missouri. City clothes, city hands, soft and pale, the kind that had never split a log or pulled a calf in a hard berth. He was maybe 40, handsome in a way that seemed to know it, and he smiled at her with a warmth that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Mrs. Voss." He said her name like he'd practiced it. "Cyrus Dalton." I represent a group of investors out of Chicago, looking to establish holdings in this territory. I understand you're managing this place alone since your husband's passing. My condolences, of course. Thank you, she said, though something in her had already gone tight and watchful, the same instinct that had gone up the back of her neck, standing over 3 bleeding horses in a stranger's draw. I won't waste your time, Mrs. Voss. A woman in your position, alone, a debt to the bank, a hard winter coming. I imagine the strain of holding this place together weighs on you considerably. He gestured at the leaning fence, the thin garden, with a small, sympathetic tilt of his head that managed to catalog every one of her failures in a single glance. My investors would pay a fair price, more than fair. Enough to see you comfortably settled somewhere less. He paused, delicate, as though searching for a kindness, less demanding. This is my land, Mr. Dalton. My husband's name is on the deed, and now mine's beside it. Of course, that same practiced smile. Though I'll say, deeds out here are trickier things than folks realize. Records get lost, offices burn, county lines get redrawn, and suddenly a filing that seemed solid as stone turns out to be resting on considerably less certain ground. He said it lightly, like a man commenting on the weather. I'd hate for you to find that out the hard way. Mrs. Voss, holding out for sentiment's sake against a fair offer today. Something cold settled into her stomach, and she thought, unbidden, of Cole's voice at the well 2 days past. Somebody drove them onto your land to build a story against one of us. My deed is filed proper, she said, in Sweetwater. Witnessed and recorded, I'm sure it is. Dalton's smile didn't move. For now, he tipped his hat, climbed back into his fine buggy, and rode off down her wagon track without waiting for her answer, as though he already knew what her answer would eventually have to be, and was simply giving her time to arrive at it herself. Delphine stood in her garden a long time. After the dust of his buggy had settled, dirt drying stiff on her forearms, and thought about the 3 horses in the draw, and the deep, deliberate thorn wound on the gray's shoulder, and Boyd Larkin riding 4 miles out of his way to vouch for a man's character before that man's name had even fully settled into her ears. Because none of it felt like coincidence anymore. Not the horses. Not this smiling man in his city coat, talking about deeds and lost records like he already had a hand on the outcome. Not the timing of any of it. Arriving in her yard within days of a stranger's herd being driven onto her fence line by somebody with a story to tell. Which meant somebody, somewhere, had already decided what was going to happen to her land. And she intended to find out who. She looked north, toward the rise that hid the Cole ranch from view, and found herself wondering. With a small, unsteady flutter she didn't have a name for yet, and wasn't ready to look at too closely, whether Nanton Cole already knew more about Cyrus Dalton than he'd let on standing at her well, with honey still on his fingers. She saddled Samson before she'd finished deciding to, because that was the thing about fear. It didn't wait politely for you to sort your feelings out first. It just moved your hands, buckled the girth, turned the horse's head north before your mind had caught, all the way up to what your body had already decided. She rode. Fast at first until Samson's breathing told her to ease off, and then steady. Mile after mile of grass gone gold-green under a sky scrubbing itself clean of clouds, and the whole way there her thoughts kept snagging on Dalton's voice, that smooth, patient voice laying it out so gentle. Records get lost. Offices burn. Like he was warning her out of kindness. Except it wasn't kindness. She knew that much. A man didn't drive 4 hours out from town in a lacquered buggy to be kind to a widow he'd never met, which meant he'd come for a reason, and the reason wasn't her. Not really, not her alone. She was too small a thing to justify that buggy, that coat, that particular species of patience. Unless she wasn't the only one he'd visited, unless he was working a bigger piece of ground than one widow's 40 acres, she thought of the 3 horses again. Driven into a draw 2 miles off the Cole fence line, left to be discovered with a story already half-built around them. Rustlers working the county line, Cole had said. And she'd thought at the time, hadn't she, that the story could point either direction, could hurt her, could hurt him. Maybe it was never meant to be either or. Maybe it was meant to hurt them both at once, and see which one of them broke first. She reached the Cole ranch a little past midday, and even in the state she was in, jaw tight, stomach in a knot, half convinced she was about to make a fool of herself riding 4 hours to warn a man who probably already knew more than she did. She couldn't help but notice the size of the place. The barns went on longer than her whole homestead. Corrals fanned out in every direction, full of good stock, fat and glossy coated. A bunkhouse big enough to sleep 20, and past it all, a house, not grand, not showy, but solid, built of good stone with a wide porch. The kind of house a man built when he intended to still be standing in it 30 years on. It had taken him years to build this. She understood that without being told. Nobody handed a man land like this. He'd fought for every acre of it, the way she was fighting for her 40, except his fight had gone on longer, and against harder odds, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time since the draw, what exactly that fight had cost him. Boyd Larkin was the one who spotted her first, coming out of the near barn with a coil of rope over one shoulder, and his face did something complicated when he saw her. Surprise, then a quick, careful look toward the house, then something that might almost have been pleased. Mrs. Voss, he came over quick, hand already up to help her down, though she didn't need it and they both knew it. Something wrong? I need to speak with Mr. Cole. He's out at the north pasture. I'll send a boy. I'll ride out, ma'am. It's a fair piece. I've ridden further today already, Mr. Larkin. Something in her voice must have carried the shape of it, because Larkin didn't argue further, just pointed her north and said he'd come along himself, and the two of them rode out together, across pasture land, thick with good grass and fat cattle, past line camps, and windmills and more of Cole's world than she'd known, existed until this morning, until they crested a low hill and saw him. He was working a young horse in a round pen, built of raw lumber, alone except for the horse, moving with a stillness that carried further than any shout, a hand raised, a step taken, the horse circling and settling. Circling and settling, the whole exchange happening in some language she didn't know the words to but understood anyway, the same language she'd used on the chestnut in the draw. He saw her coming before she'd finished the last rise, stopped what he was doing, stood at the rail with one hand resting easy on the top board, watching her ride in, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite worry, but sat somewhere close to both. Mrs. Voss, he said it careful. Something happened. A man came to my place Saturday. Cyrus Dalton. Said he represents investors out of Chicago. She didn't dismount, didn't see the point in softening it with pleasantries when the whole ride up had been spent sharpening the words down to their bone. He offered to buy my land, said it kind at first. Then he started talking about deeds, about records getting lost, about offices burning down. Cole's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it went still in a way that told her more than any change of expression could have. He say anything else? He said it like a warning. Like he already knew something was going to happen to my filing before it happened. She made herself hold his eyes. Mr. Cole, 3 of your horses turned up bleeding on the wrong side of my fence line 4 days ago. And now a man standing in my garden telling me my deed might not hold. I don't believe in that much coincidence. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just looked past her, out over his own grass, his own cattle, the whole wide kingdom he'd spent. How many years? Building up out of nothing and holding on to against everything that had tried to take it from him. I've heard the name Dalton, he said finally. Not in connection with you. In connection with 2 other outfits south of here. Small operations, widowed or old or short-handed. Both of them got offers inside a month of some kind of trouble on their land. Both of them sold within the season. The cold that had been sitting in Delphine's stomach since Saturday spread wider, sharper. You knew this, and you didn't say, I didn't know it touched you. Not until you rode up here just now and told me. His voice had gone lower, rougher at the edges. I've had men come at my land with paper before, Mrs. Voss. Forged claims, bought judges. A challenge to my deed filed twice in 9 years by men who never set foot on this ground before or after the filing. I know what it looks like, when somebody wants land badly enough to manufacture the reason for taking it. His jaw was tight now. The guarded look from the draw settled hard over his whole face. I didn't think, until right now, that whoever's circling this time might be circling both of us at once, testing which fence breaks first. Why both of us? We don't hold the same kind of ground. You've got, she gestured, helpless, at the size of everything around them, all this. I've got 40 acres and a debt. You've got water rights, on the dry wash, that feed half this valley in a drought year, a filing old enough to predate half the paper this territory's ever seen. He said it like a man who'd already done the arithmetic on her land more carefully than she had herself. And I've got the one thing men like Dalton's investors can't forge no matter how hard they try. What's that? A deed nobody can honestly contest. Filed clean, witnessed proper, paid for in full with money I earned with my own hands over 11 years. Not inherited, not granted by anybody's charity. Not resting on a single piece of paper that could be argued as unclear. His eyes came back to hers, steady, dark, and something moved behind them that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite anger. Something colder and more patient than anger. Which means the only way a man takes it from me is to make the paper itself disappear. Or make people believe it never should have existed at all. Delphine sat very still on Samson's back, the wind moving the grass around them in long silver waves, and understood, all at once, the way understanding sometimes arrived, whole and unwelcome, that she had ridden 4 hours to warn a man of a danger he'd already spent half his life learning to watch for. So what do we do? She asked. We find out exactly who's behind Dalton. And exactly what they're after. He stepped away from the rail, moved toward his own horse, tightened a cinch that didn't need tightening, the way a man's hands sometimes needed something to do while his mind worked. I'll ride to Sweetwater myself. Check the filing office. See if anybody's been asking questions about either of our deeds. I'm coming with you. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the careful, cataloging look from that first day in the draw. Something steadier. Something that had already, in the space of 1 short week, stopped needing to measure her before deciding what to make of her. All right, Mrs. Voss, he said. Lead on. It was the same 3 words he'd said to her a week before, standing over a bleeding horse in his own draw. And she caught the echo of it, and felt something warm move through the cold that had been sitting in her chest since Saturday morning. Because whatever was coming for them, whoever was coming for them, she understood. Riding back down toward the round pen, with Boyd Larkin falling in quiet behind them both. That she was no longer facing it alone, and for the first time in 8 months, that felt less like a comfort she didn't deserve, and more like the truth they agreed on it standing there by the round pen. 3 days, enough time for Cole to send word ahead to Sweetwater. Enough time for Delphine to see to her stock and dig the deed out from wherever she'd tucked it away for safekeeping, and then they'd ride together, the 2 of them, and settle the question of what exactly Cyrus Dalton and his Chicago investors thought they were owed. She rode home alone, because he had cattle to see to before dark, and she had a cow that needed milking regardless of what conspiracies were circling her fence line. And the sun was most of the way down by the time her own soddy roof came into view. She did the milking, fed Samson, checked the gray and the chestnut one more time, though they were Cole's now, back on his own land, and she found she missed the weight of caring for them, almost the moment they were gone from her yard, which struck her as a strange thing to feel over 2 horses she'd known less than a week. Except it wasn't really the horses. She knew that, standing in the dark of her own barn, with the lantern throwing long gold light across the walls. It was the work of it, the trusting of it. Somebody handing her something wounded and saying, without saying it, I believe you can fix this. Nobody had handed her anything to fix in 8 months. Nobody had trusted her with anything more delicate than a bushel of eggs. She banked the fire, sat at her own table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and let herself finally feel the whole shape of the day because it had been too much. All of it. The horses, the wounds, Cole's steady dark eyes going soft over a frightened animal, Dalton's smooth voice laying out ruin like it was a kindness, the ride north, 4 hours of fear turning over and over in her chest until it wore a groove. The ranch, bigger than anything she'd imagined. Built by a man who'd fought harder and longer than she had any idea of, for reasons she was only just beginning to understand. Until it all came apart in her at once, sitting there at her own table, and she put her face in her hands and let herself cry for the first time since November, not for Dalton. Not even entirely for the fear of losing the land. She cried for Amos, because that was where it always circled back to eventually, no matter how far the day carried her from him. She cried because he wasn't here to help her carry any of it. Not the debt, not the fear, not the strange, unsteady warmth that had moved through her, standing in a stranger's round pen, hearing him say lead on like he meant it. She cried because some small, guilty corner of her heart had felt something today that had nothing to do with grief at all, and she didn't know yet what to do with a feeling like that, 8 months into widowhood, still wearing black to church on the Sundays she went. When the crying had run its course, and it did run its course, the way storms did, blowing through hard and then leaving the air strangely clean behind them, she lit the lantern and walked out to the hill behind the barn, to the plain wooden marker she'd set over Amos herself, because she was the only one strong enough in the whole county to have carried the stone up that slope without help. Amos Voss, it read, beloved husband. 1854-1886. She sat down beside it, the way she did most evenings, when the ache got too loud to sit within doors, and she talked to him a while, low, the way she always did, telling him about the horses and the wound and the honeycrock and the strange tall stillness of a man who hadn't flinched at the size of her. You'd have liked him, I think, she said, and the wind took the words and carried them off over the dark grass. Not that I know that yet. Not really. But you always did like a man who didn't waste his words. She sat a long while. Long enough that the cold came up through the ground and into her. Long enough that Samson's, down in the corral, whickered once like he was wondering what was keeping her. I'm not looking for it, she told the marker, quiet, almost apologetic, though she couldn't have said exactly what she meant by it. Not out loud, not yet. I want you to know that. I'm not out here looking to replace you with the first man who doesn't run scared of me. The wind didn't answer. It never did, but she found, walking back down the hill toward the lantern-lit square of her own window, that she believed herself a little more than she had at an hour before, believed that whatever this new, unsteady thing was, it wasn't a betrayal of the old grief. It was only proof that the old grief hadn't managed, after everything, to kill off every part of her that was still capable of hoping she rose before dawn. Because there was a deed to find, and a debt to reckon, and 3 days wasn't a great deal of time to put a widow's whole fragile life in order before riding off toward whatever Sweetwater had waiting. She found the deed where she'd left it the week Amos died, folded into the family Bible on the shelf by the window, the paper gone soft at the creases from handling. She read it over twice by lamplight, the way she always did when the fear got too large to hold without something solid to grip. Good paper, good ink, witnessed by 2 names she recognized, filed and recorded the same month she and Amos had first walked this land together as husband and wife. It would hold. She told herself that, folding it carefully back into its place. It would hold if she could get to Sweetwater before anybody made sure it couldn't. Outside, the sky was going gray at the edges, the wind picking up out of the east again the way it so often did before a hard day, and somewhere off past the rise a horse nickered. Not Samson, not any horse of hers, but a black shape coming up the wagon track at an easy trot, a rider sitting it loose and unhurried in the strengthening light. Cole had come early, 2 days early, riding in alone with no word sent ahead, and something about the set of his shoulders told her, even from this distance, that whatever had changed his plans hadn't changed them for the better. She stood in her own doorway and watched him come, and felt the whole quiet, hopeful shape of the night before harden back into something closer to dread. Because good news didn't ride in a day early, not out here, not ever. She stepped out to meet him, and the wind came with her, same as it always did, and somewhere behind her, up on the hill, Amos's marker stood plain and silent against the brightening sky, a small, steady witness to whatever was about to begin. He didn't get down off the horse right away. That was the first wrong thing. Because Nantan Cole was not a man who sat a saddle in another person's yard when there was talking to be done. He always got down, always stood level, or as level as a man his size could manage against a woman built like she was. But this morning he sat there, reins loose in one hand, hat brim throwing a shadow clean across his eyes, and Delphine felt her stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a demand dressed up thin as one. Rode into town last night. Couldn't sleep on it. He swung down, finally slow, like his own body had gone heavy overnight. "There's talk already, Mrs. Voss, talk. About the horses." Her chest went tight. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that says a widow out east of the dry wash was found with 3 of my animals and no rope on any of them. The kind that doesn't mention you to hold them still. While I dealt with a wound, his jaw worked once. Somebody's telling it different than it happened. And telling it fast. Ran into 3 separate men on the road who'd already heard some version before I got a mile past the county line. Because that was the thing about a lie, wasn't it? It didn't need a whole day's start. It only needed a few hours and a handful of mouths willing to carry it further than the truth could run on its own 2 legs. Which was the part that frightened her most, standing there in her own yard with the morning still cold enough to see her breath. Not the lie itself, the speed of it. Because she had spent 18 years learning exactly how fast a room could decide what she was. One glance, sometimes, was all it took. One flash of her full height, crossing a doorway. And she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and sure into her stomach, that a story this convenient, this tidy, this easy to repeat over a counter or a fence rail, was going to travel faster than any truth she could offer to slow it down, until it didn't matter anymore what had actually happened in that draw. Until the story became the thing people remembered, and the truth became the thing nobody had time to go back and check. "Dalton," she said. "Maybe. Maybe somebody working for him. Maybe somebody he's paying that we haven't even put a name to yet." He looked past her, toward the barn, toward Samson standing quiet in the corral, like none of this concerned him in the least, either way. "It's moving faster than we are." She didn't cry this time. She noticed that about herself. Standing there in the cold morning light, how the fear had already burned through the softer feelings and left something harder underneath. Something closer to anger. "Then we go to Sweetwater today," she said, "not in 3 days. Today. Before whoever's telling this story gets a chance to tell it to a judge." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, she would think about this later. Turn it over more than once in the weeks that followed. Something in his face looked almost relieved, like he'd expected her to fold. Like most people, faced with a lie this size, folded first and argued second. She had never once in her life been a person who folded first. "All right," he said. "Get your deed." The ride to Sweetwater took most of the morning, the 2 of them and Boyd Larkin, who'd insisted on coming along without being asked, riding 3 abreast where the road allowed it and single file where it didn't. Nobody talked much, because there wasn't much comfort in talking. Not with the whole shape of the thing sitting so heavy between them. And because Delphine had learned already, in the short week she'd known him, that Cole did his hardest thinking in silence. Until the silence itself started to feel like something worth breaking. "Tell me about the other 2, she said. Somewhere past the halfway mark, he glanced at her sideways. "Other 2 what? The outfits. South of here. The ones Dalton's investors already bought." His mouth went flat. One was an old man, widower himself. No children left in the territory to help him work it. Fine land, good water. He sold inside 6 weeks of some trouble with his cattle. A dozen head found dead of poison weed that had never once grown on that ground before, not in 30 years of grazing it. A pause, long enough that she heard the grass moving in it. Other one was a family. Mexican family, 3 generations on that land since before it was even a territory. Somebody burned their hay barn 2 nights running. Insurance man told them the second fire looked deliberate. Sheriff never once rode out to look at it himself, And after the fires, they got an offer. Fair on paper. Not fair once you accounted for what it cost them to leave everything they'd built. Delphine rode a while with that, sitting in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed whole. Because it wasn't only her, was it? It wasn't only this one widow and this one wounded horse and this one cattle baron with a hard-won deed. It was a pattern, a method. Somebody, somewhere, had found a way to make ruin look like accident, again and again, until the ground itself gave up whoever had been foolish enough to hold on to it too long. How many, she asked. How many outfits total? That you know of. 2 for certain. I've heard rumor of a third, further south. Past the river, his eyes stayed on the road ahead. Which means whoever's by Alton isn't working one county. They're working a whole stretch of territory, picking off whatever's smallest or oldest or most alone, one piece at a time, except you're not small, or old, or alone. No, something in his voice went colder than she'd heard it go before. Which is why they didn't come after me straight on, why they went at you first. Built a lie small enough to seem believable, tied it to my land, and let it start walking before anybody thought to ask who'd set it moving. Sweetwater wasn't much of a town. One main street, a mercantile, a church, with a steeple that leaned 2 degrees off, true, a land office that had been a feed store before somebody decided the county needed official business conducted somewhere with a proper door. But it was enough of a town to have eyes in every window, and Delphine felt every one of them the moment she rode in, because a woman her size never rode into a town unnoticed. She never had. But this was different. This wasn't the usual stare and look away. The usual careful, curious cataloging of her height, her shoulders, her hands big enough to span a man's whole face. This was something sharper. A woman stepped back off the boardwalk as she passed, pulling a child close against her skirts. 2 men outside the mercantile stopped talking entirely, watched her go by with faces gone flat and unreadable, and one of them murmured something to the other low enough that she couldn't catch the words but caught the shape of them anyway. Thief? Or something close enough to it. She kept her spine straight, kept her eyes forward. Because that was the only defense she'd ever had against a room deciding what to think of her before she'd said a word. Hold still, hold tall, don't give them the satisfaction of watching you shrink. Cole rode close beside her the whole way down the street. Didn't say anything about it. Didn't need to. His presence there, level with her, unhurried, was its own kind of statement. And she understood. Watching a few of those same flat faces flick toward him and go carefully blank in a different way, that his presence carried its own weight in this town. Its own history of careful watching. Men who tipped their hats to him, out of respect for what he'd built, and men who watched him with the particular wariness some people reserved for anyone who'd succeeded at something they'd quietly hoped he wouldn't. 2 people, she thought. 2 people the town had already decided how to look at before either of them opened their mouths. Riding in together, side by side, was going to give this town a great deal more to whisper about than a stolen horse. She found she didn't much care. The land office clerk was a small man named Whit Purdy, ink-stained at the cuffs, with the particular nervous energy of someone whose hands needed to be doing something, even when there was nothing left to do. He looked up when the bell over the door rang, saw the 2 of them fill the whole doorway between them, and something crossed his face fast enough that Delphine almost missed it. Fear. Plain and simple. Gone half a second later, smoothed back under a clerk's professional blankness, but she'd seen it. Mr. Cole? Purdy's voice pitched a shade too bright. And, Mrs. Voss, is it? It is. What can I do for you both, my deed, Delphine said. I want to confirm it's still on file. Properly. Purdy's hands found a stack of papers on the counter and began straightening them, though they were already straight. Of course. Let me just. He disappeared into the back room. Came back several long minutes later, longer than the errand should have taken for a filing office this size, with his face gone a shade paler than it had been. There seems to be some irregularity, he said. Define irregularity, Cole said. Flat, quiet. The kind of quiet that carried further than shouting the Voss filing. It's not where it ought to be in the ledger. It's recorded. Mind you, I can see the entry number right here. But the physical document itself appears to have been, he swallowed, misplaced. During the reorganization. We had a reorganization last month, moved a great many files to make room for the new territorial forms. And in the confusion, a reorganization nobody informed the property owners about, Delphine said. It's a common administrative. Wit. Cole's voice hadn't risen at all, and somehow that made it worse. Look at me, Purdy looked at him, and something in the man's face crumpled, just slightly, just at the edges. The way a fence post gave way not all at once, but by degrees, by small failures accumulating, until the whole thing finally tipped. Who paid you, Cole said. I don't, Mr. Cole. I don't know what you're, Wit. The silence stretched long enough that Delphine could hear the clock on the far wall, ticking through seconds that felt each one longer than the last. I never took a thing from anybody, Purdy said. Finally, and his voice had gone small and young, the voice of a man who'd talked himself into a thing slowly enough to never quite notice the moment he'd crossed over into it. A man came through in the spring, offered to pay off a debt I owed, said all he needed was for certain files to be slow, not gone, just slow. Said it wasn't stealing, wasn't destroying anything, just administrative delay. Said it happened all the time in busy offices. What was his name? Cole said. Purdy's eyes flicked toward the door, toward the street outside where anyone might be listening, might be watching, might carry word back to whoever had bought his silence in the first place. I can't, he whispered. You don't understand what he said would happen if, Wit. Delphine said it this time, and something in her own voice surprised her. Not loud, not threatening, but steady in a way that seemed to land harder than anger would have. A woman's whole life is sitting in that ledger of yours. A man's too, and everything he spent 11 years building. You don't have to tell us everything today, but you're going to have to decide, sooner or later, whose side you're standing on. Purdy didn't answer. But he didn't look away, either, and something in his face had shifted, just barely, into the beginning of a man reconsidering. Outside on the boardwalk, a man was waiting for them. He was heavy-set, an apron still tied over his shirt from whatever he'd left mid-task, inside the mercantile across the street, and his face had the particular righteous certainty of a man who'd already tried and convicted somebody ill in his own mind and had simply been waiting for the chance to say out loud. Mrs. Voss. He didn't bother with a greeting. Ross Hardy, run the mercantile. Thought you ought to know, my wife won't be selling to you anymore. Not till this business with Mr. Cole's horses gets settled proper. There's no business to settle, Mr. Hardy, Delphine said. I help tend 3 wounded animals. That's the whole of it. That's your telling of it. It's the truth of it. Hardy's eyes flicked to Cole, standing solid and silent beside her, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite backing down, but recalculating. The way a man did when he remembered mid-sentence. Exactly whose good favor his store depended on for half its cattle trade. Mr. Cole, he said carefully. No offense meant to you, of course. Man's got every right to be generous as he pleases. It's not generosity, Ross. Cole's voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone hard as flint. It's the truth, and you'd know that. If you'd asked either one of us before you decided to punish a widow over gossip you can't even name the source of. Hardy didn't have an answer for that. He mumbled something about needing to get back to his shelves and disappeared inside. And Delphine stood on the boardwalk, a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the whole street's worth of eyes still on her, and thought with a tired familiar ache that she had built a life out of surviving exactly this. Rooms deciding what she was before she'd said a word. Doors closing quiet and polite, dressed up as somebody else's inconvenience rather than plain unkindness. I want to see it, she said, once they were mounted again and riding clear of the town. The family. The one whose barn burned. I want to see what this actually costs. Before it happens to me and I'm too far in it to see clearly. Cole considered that a long moment, then nodded and turned his horse south. The Delgado place sat 2 miles off the main road, and even from a distance Delphine could see the black scar of the old barn's foundation, a rectangle of scorched earth where good timber had stood for 3 generations before somebody decided it needed to burn. An old woman was working a small garden near the house when they rode up, spare, sun-browned, sharp-eyed in the way of someone who'd survived a great deal and intended to keep surviving whatever came next. She straightened at the sound of hooves, and her face, when she recognized Cole, softened into something that was almost relief. Senora Delgado, Cole dismounted, spoke to her with a gentleness Delphine hadn't heard from him before, careful and unhurried. "I'm sorry to trouble you again." "You are never trouble, Mr. Cole." Her English carried a soft, worn accent, decades old. Her eyes moved to Delphine, taking her in, the height of her, the plain honesty of her face, without the flinch Delphine had learned to expect. "This is the widow, the one they are talking about in town." "I am," Delphine said. The old woman nodded slowly, looked past them both toward the black scar of the burned foundation, and her jaw tightened in a way that told its own story better than words could have. "They came at night," she said. "Twice. First time we thought it was an accident. A lantern left too close to the hay. Foolish, but it happens. Second time," she shook her head. "Second time 3 weeks later, exact same spot. No lantern left anywhere near it. My grandson found boot prints in the mud the next morning, size and shape belonging to no man who works this land." "Did you tell the sheriff?" Delphine asked. Something moved through the old woman's face that was worse than anger. Resignation. The sheriff came, looked at the boot prints, wrote something in his little book, and told us wildfire was common this time of year, even from lightning, with no storm to explain it. Her mouth twisted, bitter. "We sold 4 months later. Not because we wanted to, because we understood." Finally, what the second fire had been telling us. That the third one would come for the house. Delphine sat very still on Samson's back, feeling the whole weight of it settle into her. Not as an idea anymore. Not as a warning delivered secondhand through Cole's careful telling, but as a woman's face, worn and resigned, standing beside the black scar of everything she'd lost. "I'm sorry," Delphine said. It felt thin. It felt like nowhere near enough. "Do not be sorry, Senora." The old woman's eyes came back to hers, steady, fierce despite everything. "Be careful, and do not sell, not for any price they offer. Because the price is never the point. The point is making you disappear quiet, so nobody left standing has to ask hard questions about how the land changed hands." They rode home without the deed, because the deed technically was still filed. The entry number proved that much. Proved she wasn't inventing a claim out of nothing. But the physical document itself had gone missing exactly the way Dalton had warned her it might. And no clerk's nervous apology was going to put it back on the shelf where it belonged. "He's scared," Cole said. Once they'd left the town behind and the grass had opened back up, wide and empty around them. Scared enough to bend. Not scared enough yet to break. What'll it take? Proof he can hold on to. Something bigger than a man's threat to worry over. Cole's eyes had gone distant, working something over. Or it takes somebody willing to be his proof. Willing to stand up in front of whoever's watching and say the record was tampered with, out loud, where it can't be quietly buried again. Somebody like who? He didn't answer that. Not right away, and Delphine understood. Watching the tight, careful set of his jaw, that he already had a name in mind, and that the name troubled him more than he was ready to say out loud just yet. She found the notebook 3 nights later. She'd been going through the trunk at the foot of the bed. Amos's things, mostly untouched since November, because there was a particular kind of grief in sorting a dead man's belongings that she hadn't been ready to face until now. Until fear had given her a reason bigger than sentiment to finally open the lid. It was tucked beneath his good coat. A small ledger book, the kind a man kept for tallying seed and stock. Except when she opened it, the numbers gave way after a few pages to something else entirely. Notes dated in Amos's careful, slanted hand. March 12. Came through asking about the Pruitt boundary. Odd questions. Wanted to know did I have my deed handy, would I show it to him. Told him, no business of his March 30. Same man back again, different name this time. Called himself Hollis this visit, Marsh the first time. Asked about the dry wash water. Writes, specific, something's not right about him. April 14. Road to Sweetwater. Asked Purdy about recent filings near the county line. He got wouldn't meet my eye. April 22. Wrote to my brother in Missouri. Told him if anything happens to this place, look into a man who gives two different names. I don't like the shape of what's circling. The last entry was dated the second week of November. 2 weeks before the fever took him. November 9. Feeling poorly. Chest tight, fever coming on. Will write more when I'm stronger. There was nothing after that. Delphine sat on the edge of the bed, with the notebook open in her lap, and the room went very quiet around her. Quiet enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. Quiet enough that the lantern flame seemed loud, hissing faintly against the wick because Amos had known, or half known, had seen the same shape circling their land. All those months before Dalton ever rode up her wagon track in his lacquered buggy. And he'd written it down, careful, methodical, the way he did everything. And then the fever had come and taken the rest of the story with him before he'd finished writing it. Which meant nothing yet. She made herself hold to that, hard, both hands gripping the notebook like it might otherwise fly apart in her lap. A man could get a fever in November, regardless of who'd been asking questions about his land in March. Fever didn't care about deeds and boundaries. Fever came for whoever it came for, careless, indifferent, the way it had come for half the territory, that same hard winter, except she couldn't stop hearing Cole's voice from the ride into Sweetwater. A dozen had found dead of poison weed that had never once grown on that ground before. An insurance man said the fire looked deliberate. She didn't know. That was the truest thing she could say about it, sitting there with the lantern, hissing, and Amos's careful handwriting swimming in front of her tired eyes. She didn't know if the fever had been only fever. She didn't know if Amos's death belonged on the same tally as poisoned cattle and burned barns, or if she was only building ghosts out of grief and coincidence, because it was easier to be angry at a conspiracy than to accept that sometimes a good man just died, for no reason at all, and the world kept turning anyway. But she knew she had to show Cole the notebook. Tomorrow, first thing, because if there was even a chance, even the smallest, most unbearable chance, that Amos hadn't simply been unlucky, that somebody's greed had reached into her life a full year before she ever knew to be afraid of it, she owed him the truth. Whatever it turned out to be. The town's whispering found its way to church that Sunday, the way whispering always eventually did, dressed up in its good clothes, and sitting in its usual pew like it had every right to be there. Delphine felt it the moment she walked in. The particular quality of silence that fell over a room when everyone in it already had an opinion and was only waiting for permission to voice it. Mrs. Hardy from the Mercantile turned in her seat to whisper something to the woman beside her, eyes flicking toward Delphine and away, quick, deliberate. A man near the back, one of the two who'd stopped talking outside a Mercantile the day she rode into Sweetwater, didn't bother lowering his voice at all. Heard she was caught red-handed. Cole's too soft-hearted to press it is all. Because that was the shape the lie had taken. By now 3 weeks grown and fattened on repetition. Not a widow helped tend 3 wounded horses. Now it was caught red-handed, and too soft-hearted to press it. Words that turned kindness into evidence, and evidence into a story about a man too foolish or too smitten to see a thief standing right in front of him. She sat very still in her pew. Because there was nothing else to do with a room full of people who'd already decided what she was. She'd learned that lesson at 17, in a different church, in a different life, and she'd hoped, foolishly, she understood now, that widowhood and 8 months of quiet, careful living might have finally bought her some peace from it. It hadn't. It never really did. The door opened behind her, late, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She felt the room's attention shift before she heard his boots on the floorboards, felt the particular charge that moved through a congregation when somebody walked in that half of them respected, and Thea resented, for reasons they'd never quite admit, out loud. Cole didn't sit in the back, where a man might sit if he wanted to slip in unnoticed. He walked the full length of the aisle, past every whispering pair of eyes, and sat down beside her. Close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. Close enough that there wasn't a single person in that church who could mistake it for coincidence. The whispering stopped. all at once, like a held breath. "You didn't have to do that," Delphine murmured. Once the preacher had started in on the morning's text, and the room's attention had reluctantly turned forward. "Didn't do it for you," Cole said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Did it because I'm tired of watching liars get the last word in a room I've got just as much right to sit in as anybody. They'll say worse now, about both of us. Let them." His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the preacher, but his voice had gone something close to gentle. "I've spent 11 years building a life in a county that spent most of those years waiting for me to fail. I know how to survive people talking, Mrs. Voss. What I don't know how to survive is watching somebody honest get run off her own land. Because a room full of cowards would rather believe a lie than ask a single hard question. She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that wouldn't have come out of her voice, cracked clean in half. So she sat there, beside him, spine straight, chin level, and let the whole church see exactly what it was going to see, and found, somewhere under the fear, under the fresh, raw grief of Amos's notebook, still sitting folded in her coat pocket, a small, fierce gladness that she wasn't sitting there alone. Outside after, the congregation filed into the churchyard, in its usual slow clusters of conversation, and it was there, in the thin morning sun, that the whispering finally found its nerve enough to speak up in full voice. "Some of us don't think it's Christian," a woman's voice said, pitched just loud enough to carry. Encouraging a thief by sitting beside her in the Lord's own house, Delphine turned. It was Mrs. Hardy, from earlier, standing with two other women near the churchyard gate, her chin lifted with the particular righteousness of someone who believed gossip, dressed up as piety, no longer counted as gossip at all. "I've stolen nothing, Mrs. Hardy," Delphine said, keeping her voice level though her whole body had gone rigid. "That's not what folks are saying. Folks are saying a great many things that never happened. That doesn't make them true. It only makes them loud." Mrs. Hardy's mouth thinned. "A woman your size," she said, and let the sentence hang there a moment, letting everyone within earshot fill in the rest of it themselves. A woman your size could do anything, take anything, frighten anyone into silence, and who would stop her, before she finished it plain? Folks are entitled to be cautious. The old, familiar shame rose up in Delphine's chest, quick and hot, the same shame that had followed her. Through every doorway she'd ever had to duck through, every church pew she'd ever had to fold herself into, every room that had ever gone quiet and careful the moment she filled its doorway. She opened her mouth and found, for once in her life, that she didn't have a single word ready. Cole stepped forward before the silence could stretch any further. "Mrs. Hardy," he said, and his voice hadn't risen, but something underneath it had gone hard as riverbed stone. "You've known Mrs. Voss 3 weeks. I've known her the same. In that time, she's shown more honest kindness to a stranger's wounded animal than I've seen this whole congregation show a widow living alone, since the day her husband was buried." He let that sit a moment. "Caution's a fine thing, but what you're practicing isn't caution. It's cruelty wearing caution's coat because cruelty's harder to defend plainly, out loud in front of God." Mrs. Hardy's face went a mottled shade of red, and she turned and walked off toward her buggy without another word, the two women beside her trailing after, throwing glances back over their shoulders that Delphine no longer had it in her to meet. "You didn't have to do that either," she said once they were alone again. "I know," Cole said. "Didn't stop me wanting to." They talked that evening on her porch. After he'd ridden the 4 miles out to see her home safe, though she hadn't asked him to, and both of them knew, Samson would have managed the ride just fine without an escort. She showed him the notebook. He read it twice through by lantern light, his face gone very still, very careful the way it went. Whenever something had cut him deeper than he intended to show. Marsh. Hollis. He said the 2 false names slow, testing them. "I don't know either one, but I know the pattern of it now. Same as Purdy, same as whoever burned that family's hay barn 2 nights running. Somebody scouting a piece of land months before they move on it, learning its weak points, its water rights, its boundary disputes. Whether the man holding the deed has family close to make trouble if something happens to him. You think somebody killed him. The word sat heavy in the dark between them. She'd been circling it for 3 days without quite letting herself land on it, and hearing it out loud in her own voice, in the quiet of her own porch, made it real in a way the notebook alone hadn't managed. Cole was quiet a long moment. I think I don't know, and I think that not knowing is its own kind of cruelty, and I'm sorry you're carrying it. He looked at her, steady, dark eyes, catching what little lantern light there was. But I think whoever's behind this has already proven they're willing to poison cattle. Burn barns 2 nights running until a family finally breaks. Bribe a nervous little clerk with a debt he couldn't pay any other way. A pause. I don't think Fever answering so conveniently, right when a man started writing down names, is something either of us can afford to call coincidence and walk away from. Delphine sat with that, felt the porch boards solid beneath her, felt Samson shift and settle, somewhere in the dark of the corral, felt the whole wide, unanswering night pressing in around the two of them. Then we don't walk away, she said. No. Cole agreed. We don't. And something about the stillness of hymns, sitting there in the lantern light with Amos's careful handwriting held gentle between his 2 large hands, made her ask the question she'd been circling for weeks without ever quite finding the courage to land on it. Larkin told me once you buried a wife, she said. And a son. Cole didn't look up right away. His thumb moved once, absent, along the edge of the notebook's cover. 11 years ago, he said finally, before I built any of what you saw at the ranch. We had a smaller place then. Good land, but modest. A man named Sorrel wanted it. Wanted the water on it, mostly, same as most every fight out here, eventually comes down to water. His voice had gone very even, very controlled. The voice of a man who'd told himself this story enough times. In the dark, that he'd worn all the rawest edges off it, or told himself he had. He made an offer. I refused it. He made a second offer, lower than the first, which should have told me something about what kind of man makes an offer that shrinks instead of grows. I refused that too. What happened? Fire. Middle of the night, height of summer, dry as a match head that whole season. He was quiet a moment. I was out with the herd. 3 miles off, night watching a bull that had a habit of wandering. By the time I saw the light in the sky and rode back, the house was mostly gone. My wife got out. Our son didn't. He was 8 weeks old. Delphine felt something in her chest crack open, slow and total, the way ice went on a pond in early spring. Not all at once, but in one long fracture that split the whole surface at the same time. It's all right, he said gentle, noticing the tears standing in her eyes before she'd said a word. My wife lived 4 more years after. Never was the same. Grief does that sometimes. Takes the body but leaves the person behind in it, walking around what used to be a whole life. She passed of consumption in the end. I've never been entirely sure if it was truly the sickness that took her, or if the sickness only finally found an opening, because there wasn't enough of her left to fight it, and the man. Sorrel never proved a thing against him. Sheriff at the time called it an accident. Same as they called the Delgado. Fire's an accident. Same as I'd wager they'll call whatever happens to your fence line an accident too. If it comes to that, his eyes came up to hers, dark and steady. Something old and terrible sitting quiet behind them. I bought this land back, piece by piece, over 11 years, with money I earned honest. Because I decided a long time ago that the only answer to a man who tries to take everything from you with fire and lies is to build something so solid, so plainly and legally yours, that fire and lies stop being enough to move it. Delphine sat with that a long moment, the lantern hissing soft between them, and felt the old grief in her own chest rise up to meet his, unbidden, the way grief always seemed to recognize its own kind. We lost a child too, she said, Aphis and I, before he died, a girl. Born too early in the spring before his fever took him. Her voice when it came sounded strange to her own ears, thinner than she meant it to, the words worn smooth from being said silently, 1,000 times inside her own head and almost never out loud. I held her an hour. That's all we had. An hour. And then she was gone, and Amos held me all that night, and neither one of us said a word. Because there wasn't a word big enough to hold what we were carrying. I'm sorry, Cole said, quiet. Not the practiced condolence he'd offered the first day in her yard over Amos's fever. Something rawer than that. Everyone always says that, Delphine said. I've stopped knowing what to do with it. Then I won't say it again. He set the notebook down, careful on the porch boards between them, and after a moment, slow enough that she had every chance to pull away, and didn't. He reached over and laid one hand flat over both of hers, where they sat folded in her lap. His palm was rough, warm, large enough, even against her own considerable hands, to cover them entirely. I'll just sit here instead, however long you need somebody to. She didn't pull away. She let her hand turn beneath his, slow, until their fingers laced together in the lantern light. And for a long while neither of them said anything at all. Just sat there on the porch boards with the whole wide, dark prairie breathing around them. Two people who had each already buried more than their fair share of what they loved. Learning, cautious and unhurried, how to hold something new without bracing for it to be taken. I'm not looking to replace what I lost, she said eventually, echoing, though he didn't know it, the same words she'd said to a wooden grave marker on a hillside 3 weeks before. I want you to know that. I know it, he said. I'm not looking to replace mine either. Some things don't get replaced. They just, he searched for it, careful, the way he searched for most things he said out loud. They make room, eventually, for something else to sit alongside them, without crowding them out. Is that what this is? She asked. Making room? I think it might be, he said. I think I'd like to find out, if you'd let me. The wind moved through the grass beyond the porch rail, low and steady, and somewhere out in the dark Samson shifted his weight and settled. And Delphine sat there, with her hand held warm, inside Nanton Cole's, and understood that whatever came next, whatever Dalton and Judge Kane and the whole quiet, patient machinery of greed circling both their lives intended to throw at them, she was no longer facing any of it from the outside of her own life looking in. She was facing it from inside something that had, without her quite noticing the exact moment it happened, become a life shared. Boyd Larkin rode out to her place 2 days after that, alone, without his usual easy talk about weather and grass, and she knew before he'd swung down off his horse that whatever he'd brought with him wasn't small. Mr. Cole sent me, he said. Wanted you to hear this before it caught you unready. Hear what? I did some asking around Sweetwater, quiet-like. Man I know who clerks for the circuit court mentioned a name. I didn't expect to hear connected to any of this. He turned his hat in his hands, slow, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their weight. Judge Aldous Kane. He's set to preside over any dispute involving contested filings in this county. Come the new term, I don't know the name. No reason you should. He's new to the circuit, appointed this past spring. Out of Denver, on the recommendation of some business concern back east. Larkin's jaw tightened. My friend says the appointment came through unusual quick. Says there was talk, at the time, of money changing hands to smooth the way. Nothing anybody could prove. Just talk. Delphine felt the cold settle back into her stomach. Familiar now. An old visitor she was getting far too used to answering the door for. Denver, she said slowly. Same as Dalton's investors. Same territory, at least. Might be nothing. Might be everything. Larkin looked at her, steady, older eyes carrying more worry in them than his easy manner usually let show. Mr. Cole wanted you to know before you walked into any hearing expecting a fair judge. Wanted you to have time to get ready for the other kind. She thanked him and watched him ride off, and stood a long while in her own yard, turning the pieces over. The clerk, bought quiet with a debt paid off. The judge, appointed unusual quick, out of the same distant city where Dalton claimed his investors made their home. The fires, the poisoned cattle. Amos's careful unfinished notebook, cut short 2 weeks before, a fever nobody had thought to question until now. Because it wasn't scattered anymore, was it? It wasn't a handful of unlucky coincidences happening to unlucky people who'd simply drawn the short straw of misfortune. It was a machine, quiet, patient, built piece by piece, out of bribed clerks and appointed judges and minjums, willing to strike a match in the dark of night, and it had been running a long while before she'd ever noticed its gears turning close enough to catch her. The notice came 4 days later. nailed to her own front door, plain and official-looking, bearing a county seal she didn't fully trust anymore, and a signature she didn't recognize at all, Judge Aldous Kane. Of the Territorial Court, ordering a formal hearing on the dispute at Voss, filing to be held in Sweetwater in 9 days' time, at which the property in question would be provisionally held under county authority, pending resolution, provisionally held, which meant, in the plain language nobody had bothered to use, that somebody with a judge's seal behind them intended to take her land before a single honest hearing had even begun. She rode to the coal ranch with the notice, clutched in one fist, and found him already saddling up, already grim-faced, already holding a notice of his own, a separate paper. Same seal, same unfamiliar signature, ordering a review of certain boundary claims connected to the coal holdings, citing irregularities in filings dating back 11 years. They stood in his yard, the two of them, each holding proof of the same coming storm, and understood, without either one needing to say it aloud, that whatever quiet, careful thing had been building between them over these past weeks was about to be tested by something a great deal larger than either one of them had reckoned on facing alone. 9 days, Delphine said. 9 days. Cole agreed and folded the notice once, hard like a man folding away his own fear to make room for whatever came next. Then we'd best find out exactly who Judge Kane answers to before we run out of them. They sat at her kitchen table that night, with both notices spread flat between them, and a single lantern throwing long shadows across the wood, and worked through what 9 days actually gave them. Because 9 days wasn't nothing. She kept telling herself that, turning it over like a coat, she was trying to convince herself, was worth more than it looked. 9 days was enough time to ride back to the Delgado place and ask the old woman, plain and direct, whether she'd be willing to speak in front of a hearing about the boot prints in the mud and the sheriff's little book. 9 days was enough time to go back to Whit Purdy, alone, this time, without Cole's height and weight of reputation crowding the room, and see whether a woman who understood exactly what it cost to be disbelieved might reach him in a way Cole's flat authority hadn't quite managed. He's scared of losing more than his position, Delphine said, thinking it through out loud. A debt, he said, paid off, which means whoever's behind this knows something about him he doesn't want known. That's a different kind of scared than a man being threatened outright. Different how? A man threatened outright has nothing left to lose by talking. A man ashamed has everything left to lose. Shame keeps its own kind of silence. Longer and quieter than fear does, she said it slow, working it out even as the words left her, because she was thinking of her own 18 years of learned quiet. The particular silence a person built up around whatever the world had taught them to be ashamed of, sighs or debt or grief or all three at once. If I go to him alone. Woman to man, without Mr. Cole standing over him reminding him how much bigger this all is than his own small mistake. Maybe he hears something different than a threat. Cole considered that, his dark eyes steady on her across the lantern light. You'd be riding into Sweetwater alone, with half that town already believing you're a thief. I've survived worse than a town's opinion, I know you have. Something moved behind his eyes, careful, protective, and for a moment she thought he might argue it further. He didn't. All right, you go to Purdy. I'll ride to the Delgado place myself, ask Senora Delgado whether she'd testify, and see if I can't find out more about this Judge Kane before he ever sets foot in a courtroom against us. And Dalton? Dalton I'll deal with myself when the time comes. His jaw had gone tight again. That old banked anger surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down. A man like that doesn't answer to reason. He answers to consequence. I intend to make sure he understands exactly what consequence looks like. Once we've got enough proof standing behind us that a bought judge can't wave it away without the whole territory watching him do it. They worked through the rest of it slow, methodical, dividing up the 9 days like rationed food. 2 days for Purdy and the Delgado testimony, 3 for whatever Cole could dig up about Kane's appointment, the remaining 4 to prepare whatever case they could carry into that hearing room and lay out plain enough that even a bought judge would have trouble looking away from it in front of a watching town. It was well past midnight by the time they finished. Cole stood, stretched the stiffness out of his shoulders, and Delphine walked him out to where his black horse stood, waiting in the dark. Delphine. He said her given name, quiet, like he was testing the weight of it out loud for the first time. Nantan, she answered, matching him, and felt something warm move through her at the sound of it. Small and steady against the whole cold weight of everything bearing down on them both. Whatever happens in that hearing room, he said. Whatever Kane decides. Whatever Dalton throws at us before we get there. I want you to know I'm not walking away from this, not from the land. Not from the fight. A pause, his eyes holding hers in the dark. Not from you, I know, she said, and found saying it, that she truly did. Some old, cautious, self-protecting part of her finally quiet enough to simply believe a good thing, without immediately bracing for it to be taken away. I'm not walking away, either, he mounted, and rode off north into the dark. And Delphine stood in her own yard a long while, after the sound of his horse had faded, looking up at a sky gone thick and bright with stars, thinking of 9 days, and a bought judge, and an old woman's boot prints in the mud, and a man's careful unfinished handwriting, cut short, 2 weeks before a fever, that might, after everything, have been no accident at all. She didn't see the rider on the far ridge, didn't know, standing there, in her own dark yard, with her heart still warm from the sound of her own name, in Nantan Cole's mouth, that half a mile off, sitting his horse motionless against the tree line. A man in a fine city coat had been watching the whole exchange through a spyglass, borrowed from one of Dalton's hired hands. Watching the two of them stand close in the lantern light, watching the black horse ride off north, watching a widow who was supposed to be frightened and alone, stand instead in her own yard looking something closer to certain. Cyrus Dalton lowered the glass, slow, and turned his own horse back toward town, already turning over in his mind exactly how much sooner than 9 days. This particular problem might need solving, because a frightened widow was easy enough to move off a piece of land. A widow who'd stopped being frightened was something else entirely, and something else entirely was a problem that called, in Dalton's considerable experience, for considerably sharper tools than a judge's paper and a clerk's quiet debt. 3 nights after the notice went up on her door, smoke woke her. Not much of it, just enough to catch at the back of her throat before her mind had fully surfaced from sleep, and Delphine was up out of bed and moving before she'd even finished deciding to be afraid. Because that was the thing about a body her size. It didn't wait for permission. It moved first, thought second. And she was already at the window, with her nightdress still tangled around her knees, when she saw the orange light licking up the side of her barn. No, she said it out loud, to no one, to the empty room, to the whole unfair shape of the night. No, not tonight. Not after everything. Not after the notice, and the hearing date, and the small, fragile hope she'd let herself carry these past 2 weeks, like something cupped careful in both hands. Which was foolish. Which she'd known was foolish even while she carried it, hadn't she? Some old bruised part of her whispering all along. That hope this size never survived long out here, uncontested, except knowing a thing was foolish, had never once stopped her from wanting it anyway. She didn't stop to dress, didn't stop for boots. She ran barefoot out into the yard, and the cold of the ground barely registered against the heat already rolling off the barn in waves, and she could hear Samson screaming inside it, that terrible, high animal sound a horse only made when fire had it cornered, and something in her chest went past fear entirely into a kind of blank, singular purpose that left no room for anything else. Get the door. Get the horse. Think about the rest of it after. She got the door. It was barred from the outside, barred, which her own hands had never done, which meant somebody had done it for her, somebody who'd wanted that door to stay shut, regardless of what was screaming behind it. And she tore the bar free, with both hands so fast, the wood split and threw splinters across her forearms that she wouldn't even feel until morning. Smoke rolled out to meet her, thick and choking. She went in anyway. Because Samson was in there, and Samson had carried her weight faithfully for 2 years without once complaining about the load, and she was not going to stand outside a burning barn and listen to him die in it. She found him by sound more than sight, rearing against his stall, eyes wild and white-rimmed, and she got a hand on his halter and talked to him. Low, urgent, the same steady hum she'd used on a frightened chestnut stud 3 weeks, and a whole lifetime ago. And somehow, someway, he heard her through the panic enough to let her lead him. They broke out into the cold night air together. Horse and woman both coughing, both singed, and Delphine went down on her knees in the dirt of her own yard and watched her barn burn. Cole reached her within the hour. He'd seen the glow from 4 miles off, he told her later. Riding hard through the dark with Boyd Larkin and 2 other hands behind him, and by the time they arrived the barn was past saving. A smoking ruin collapsed in on itself. But the house still stood, and Samson still stood, and Delphine still stood, wrapped in a horse blanket somebody had thrown over her shoulders, staring at what was left. "You're hurt." He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, hands finding her forearms, careful over the splinter wounds, his face gone pale under its weathered brown in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'm alive," she said. "The barn wasn't. The bar on the door wasn't mine. I never bar that door. There's no reason to, out here, alone." She looked at him and felt the shaking finally catch up with her, delayed. The way it always did once, the immediate danger had passed and left room for the body to remember how frightened it had actually been. Somebody wanted that door held shut. Somebody wanted Samson to burn in there. Cole's jaw went tight enough that a muscle jumped in his cheek. Dalton, or somebody working for him. She was crying now, she realized, though she couldn't have said exactly when it started, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "He's done waiting on Judge Kane, Nanton. He's done waiting on paper at all." Boyd Larkin came up, leading a length of rope in one hand, his face grim in the firelight. "Found something. Out past the corral. Fella running, moving fast for the tree line. Winged him with a shot before he made it. He's not going anywhere." They found him 20 yards into the brush, a thin, wiry man with a bullet graze along his upper arm, and a face gone gray with fear that had nothing to do with the wound. Larkin hauled him up by the collar and marched him back toward the smoking ruin of the barn, and the man's eyes went wide and darting between Delphine's considerable height and Cole's flat, murderous calm, like he couldn't decide which one frightened him more. "Name," Cole said. "I ain't done nothing. You barred a woman's barn door with her horse still inside it. Set the whole thing alight. That's attempted murder, in this territory, same as anywhere else." Cole's voice hadn't risen at all, and somehow that made it land harder than shouting would have. "Name, Riley," the man said, fast, the fear finally winning out over whatever loyalty he'd been paid to keep. "Sam Riley." "I didn't want to do it, mister." "I swear it, but Dalton said." "Dalton hired you direct, man who works for him. Fella named Gantry. Said it needed doing quiet. Said the fire'd look like accident, same as always, said." Riley's words tumbled faster now. "The dam fully broken." Said Dalton wanted her scared bad enough to sell before the hearing, on account of the boss man's getting nervous. Said something about a fella name of Sorrell, back east, wanting this whole business wrapped up quick, on account of some other trouble catching up to him. Delphine felt Cole go very still beside her. "Sorrel," he said. "Quiet, careful. The way a man said a word he'd hoped never to hear again. That's the name I heard. Older fella. Never met him myself. Only heard Gantry say it once. Complaining about how demanding the old man's gotten since his son took over running things." "His son," Cole repeated. Riley nodded, miserable, cradling his bleeding arm. Cyrus Dalton. "Only that ain't his birth name. Way Gantry told it. Drunk one night. Said the old man changed it, the boy's name, years back, on account of trouble the family had out west. Some fire, way back. Some folks died in it. Old man wanted a fresh name for his boy to build a new business under, quiet-like, far from wherever the trouble happened." The night went very silent around them. Delphine watched the color drain entirely out of Nanton Cole's face, watched 11 years of careful, hard-built control sit balanced on a knife's edge, and understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep into her bones, exactly what name belonged in the space Riley had left empty. "Sorrel," Cole said again, and this time his voice had gone somewhere. Delphine had never heard it go before, low and old and terrible. The man who burned my first home to the ground, who killed my son. Cyrus Dalton is his boy, which meant. Delphine's mind kept stumbling over it, unable to fit the shape of it into anything smaller than what it actually was. Which meant the smiling man who'd stood in her garden, talking about lost records like a kindness, had grown up in a house built on the ashes of another man's grief. Which meant somewhere back east, right now, an old man who'd once struck a match against a sleeping family's home was sitting comfortable in some fine parlor, still profiting, still reaching, still teaching his son the same patient cruelty that had cost Nantan Cole everything. 11 years before either of them had ever heard the name Voss, until it didn't feel like coincidence at all anymore, until it felt instead like a single long thread that had never once stopped being pulled, tightening slow around this whole valley for over a decade. Waiting for the day it finally reached far enough to close around a giant widow's 40 acres too. Riley, still on his knees in the dirt, looked between the two of them with the dawning, miserable understanding of a small man who'd just realized he'd been a single stitch in something far larger and far uglier than he'd ever been told. I didn't know, he's wheezing. About the fire. About your boy, mister. Gantry never said none of that part. No, Cole said. I don't imagine. He did. His voice had gone flat now, exhausted past the point of anger. The way grief sometimes finally settled, once it had burned through its hottest layer. Get him to the ranch, Boyd. Tie him proper. We'll bring him to the sheriff in the morning. Once I trust myself to look at him without wanting to finish what that bullet started. Larkin hauled Riley up and led him off toward the horses, and Delphine and Nantan stood alone in the smoking, firelit yard, the two of them, and the ruined barn, and 11 years of buried grief finally standing exposed to the open night air. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The barn popped and settled behind them, sending up a fresh shower of sparks against the dark sky. And Delphine stepped close enough to lay a hand flat against Cole's chest, feeling his heart hammering hard and fast beneath her palm. Nantan, 11 years. His voice had gone rough, raw at the edges. 11 years I built this ranch, thinking I'd buried that fight along with my wife and my son, and it was never buried at all. It just went quiet, changed its name. Waited, it's not the same fight, Delphine said. Though even as she said it, she understood how thin the words sounded against the size of what he was carrying. It's not the same fire, it's the same family, the same hunger, the same willingness to burn whatever stands between them and what they want. He looked past her, at the smoking ruin of her barn, and something in his face hardened into a resolve so complete. It frightened her a little. Even loving him the small distance she'd allowed herself to love him so far. They came at you the same way they came at me. And I let it happen twice, 11 years apart. Because I thought the fight was finished the first time. You didn't let anything happen. She took his face in both her hands, made him look at her, the whole considerable size of her, filling his vision the way it filled every doorway she'd ever walked through, except this time. This one precious time. It didn't feel like something to apologize for. It felt like exactly enough. You rode here the second you saw the smoke. You've been fighting this since, before I even knew there was a fight. That's not letting something happen, Nantan. That's showing up. Something in his face broke open, slow, the same way it had broken open on her porch 2 weeks before, telling her about a wife and a son he'd carried alone for 11 years. The hearings, in 6 days, he said, finally. We have Riley. We have his confession. We have a name, Sorrel, Dalton connected direct to whoever's been paying Purdy and appointing judges out of Denver. His jaw set hard. This ends in that hearing room. All of it. 11 years of it. And whatever this last month's been building toward for you. It ends there, in front of the whole town, where nobody with a bought badge or a bought bench can quietly bury it afterward. The 6 days that followed moved fast and slow at once, the way time always seemed to, during the stretch right before something enormous finally arrived. Delphine rode into Sweetwater alone on the second day, as planned, and found Whit Purdy behind his counter, looking thinner than he had 2 weeks before, like the weight of his own silence had been eating at him from the inside. Mrs. Voss. He didn't quite meet her eyes. "I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Purdy." She kept her voice gentle, the way she might gentle a spooked animal, because that was, in the end, exactly what he was. "I'm here to tell you something I understand better than most people in this town might guess," looking at me. He looked up, wary. "I know what it is to be looked at and judged before anybody's asked a single honest question," she said. "I've spent my whole life inside a body people decided things about on sight. Frightening, unnatural, dangerous, sometimes. Just for taking up the space I was born to take up." She let that sit a moment. "You've spent months now inside a decision people would judge you for too, if they knew it. A debt. A man who found your weak spot and pressed on it until you bent. That's not the same shame as mine. But I think you understand, better than most, what it costs to be defined forever by the worst thing anybody ever caught you doing." Purdy's hands had gone still on the counter. "A barn burned 2 nights ago," Delphine said, "with my horse inside it. A man's confessed to setting it, and confessed to who paid him, and the name leads straight back through Cyrus Dalton, to whoever's behind him." She held his gaze, steady. "You can keep being the frightened man who let a debt turn him into somebody else's tool. Or you can be the man who finally told the truth in a room full of people at the exact moment it mattered enough to matter. I can't make that choice for you, Mr. Purdy. I can only tell you which one lets you sleep through the night again." He was quiet a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone thick. "I'll testify," he said. "God help me, I'll testify." Senora Delgado agreed the same afternoon, without hesitation, her sharp old eyes gone fierce and bright when Cole told her what the boy Riley had confessed. "I have waited 2 years for someone to finally ask me properly," she said. "I will stand in front of that judge and tell him exactly what boots I saw, pressed into my own mud, the notebook, the confession, the 2 witnesses. It built, day by day, into something solid enough to carry into a room and set down hard on a table where nobody could quietly sweep it back into the shadows." On the 4th day, Delphine rode back to her own place, what was left of it, the black scar of the barn still smoking faintly in the mornings, to check on the house and gather a few things, and found herself, without quite deciding to, walking up the hill behind the ruined barn instead. Nantan came with her. Didn't ask why. Just followed a step behind, quiet, patient, the way he'd learned to be patient with whatever grief still needed tending in her. Amos's marker stood plain against the hillside, weathered a little more than it had been in the spring, and Delphine knelt beside it the way she always did. And for a long moment didn't say anything at all. "I found your notebook," she said finally. "I know now you'd already started seeing the shape of this, months before it caught up with either of us. I wish you'd told me. I wish you'd trusted me to carry the fear alongside you instead of carrying it alone until it was too late to matter." The wind moved through the grass, same as always, offering no answer, same as always. "I'm getting married again," she said, and felt Nantan go very still behind her, giving her the space to say the rest of it in her own time. "His name's Nantan. He's steady, and he's kind under all that quiet, and he doesn't flinch at the size of me, same as you never did." She pressed her palm flat against the cool wood of the marker. "I know loving him doesn't undo loving you. I've been afraid of that, some nights. Afraid that, making room for something new, meant packing away what we had, like it mattered, less. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think you'd have liked him. I think you'd have told me to stop wasting good daylight, being afraid of my own happiness." She stood, finally, and Nantan stepped up beside her and looked down at the marker with a quiet, respectful stillness. "Thank you," he said, simply, "for the notebook. For the warning you left behind, without meaning it as one. I think, in his own way, your husband's still fighting alongside us in that hearing room, tomorrow, whether he ever meant to or not." Delphine reached for his hand, and they stood there together a while longer. The widow and the rancher and the quiet, steady ghost of a good man who'd loved her first. And when they finally walked back down the hill toward the horses, she found the old grief had settled into something lighter than it had carried in a long while. Not gone, never entirely gone, but finally, fully, at peace with what was growing up alongside it. But it was on the 5th night, the night before the hearing, that the final piece arrived, riding hard into the coal ranch yard well past dark. A telegraph boy from the territorial capital, with a wire that Boyd Larkin had sent for days before, chasing down the truth of Judge Aldous Kane's sudden appointment. Cole read it once by lamplight, read it again, and when he looked up at Delphine, sitting across the table from him, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold hours before, something had settled into his face that looked, for the first time in 6 days, almost like peace. Kane's brother-in-law, he said, sits on the board of a land investment concern out of Denver. Same concern that holds paper on half the businesses Sorrells built his fortune moving through over the years. He set the telegram down, careful, on the table between them, and it started with water. This whole valley's worth of it runs through your 40 acres in a dry year. The same water that would have let Sorrell choke off every ranch downstream, mine included. If he'd gotten your deed quiet before anybody thought to ask why a Chicago investor wanted one widow's dry wash so badly, his jaw was tight. It's all connected, every piece of it. Sorrell and his son wearing a new name, and a judge who owes his whole appointment to his own wife's brother, sitting comfortable on the very board that stands to profit from whatever that judge rules tomorrow. Then tomorrow, Delphine said, we make sure the whole town watches him rule it anyway, and watches exactly what it costs him to try. She couldn't sleep that last night before the hearing. Lay in the dark of the small room she'd taken at the ranch house. Nanton had insisted, after the fire, that she and Samson both stay close enough to watch over until the whole business was settled, and she hadn't had the will left to argue him out of it, and stared up at a ceiling she couldn't see, running the whole 6 weeks over in her mind, like a rosary worn smooth from handling, until she gave up on sleep entirely and went out to the porch and found him already there, sitting in the dark with a cup of coffee, gone cold beside him, staring out at nothing. Couldn't sleep either, she said. Haven't tried very hard to. He shifted over on the step to make room for her, though there was more than enough room already, and something in the small, ordinary gesture of it, making space for her, without her having to ask, settled something anxious in her chest that even the notebook and the confession, and all 6 weeks of careful evidence gathering, hadn't quite managed to settle. Are you frightened? She asked. Of tomorrow. He was quiet a moment. Not of losing the land. I've built and lost before, and I know now I can build again if it comes to that. His eyes found hers in the dark. I'm frightened of standing in that room and saying Sorrell's name out loud, in front of the whole county, and feeling 11 years of grief come up all over again like it's fresh. Like no time's passed at all since the fire. It'll come up, Delphine said, gentle. There's no way through a thing like that which doesn't cost something on the way, I know it. He reached over, found her hand in the dark, laced his fingers through hers the way he had that first night with the notebook. But I've noticed something, these past weeks, that I didn't expect to notice. The grief doesn't sit as heavy when there's somebody beside me, carrying part of the weight of it. I'd forgotten that was even possible. Forgot it so long I'd stopped missing it. The way you stop missing a taste you've gone years without eating. I know that feeling, she said. I'd stopped missing it too. They sat there a long while, not talking. Just two people holding hands in the dark, before the hardest day either of them had faced in longer than either cared to count, and somewhere out past the corral a coyote called once, into the night, and was answered, and the sound of it, lonesome, but not unaccompanied, seemed to Delphine like its own small omen of what tomorrow might yet hold. The hearing was held in the largest room Sweetwater had. The church, in fact, its pews rearranged, its leaning steeple, casting a long, thin shadow across the dirt street outside. Because the land office itself was far too small to hold what the whole county had turned out to see. Delphine had never in her life felt so many eyes on her at once, and for once in her life she found she didn't mind it. Because this time she wasn't standing in a doorway being measured and found strange. She was standing beside Nanton Cole, at the front of a packed room, about to watch the truth finally outrun the lie that had been chasing her for 6 long weeks. Judge Aldous Kane sat behind a borrowed table at the front, A thin, precise man with wire spectacles, and the bloodless composure of someone who had clearly expected this to be a formality. Cyrus Dalton sat in the second row, still in his fine city coat, still wearing that same practiced smile, though something around his eyes had gone tighter since Delphine had last seen it in her own garden. This hearing, Kane began, concerns the provisional status of the Voss and Cole land filings, pending review of certain, Your Honor. Cole stood. Before you proceed, the defense requests the court hear testimony directly relevant to the character and legitimacy of these filings, and to the character of the parties bringing the challenge against them. Kane's mouth thin. This is not that kind of proceeding, Mr. Cole. It is now, Cole said, or it will be the kind of proceeding this whole town watches you refuse to allow. A murmur moved through the packed pews. Kane's eyes flicked briefly toward Dalton, and Delphine watched it happen. Watched the whole room watch it happen. A small, involuntary glance that told its own quiet story before a single witness had even been called. Very well, Kane said tight. Proceed. Dalton leaned toward Kane's table. Low, urgent. Your Honor, this is theater, nothing more. A rancher and a widow spinning a tale to save themselves a piece of contested ground. You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Dalton, Kane said, though something in his own voice had already gone thinner than it had been a minute before. Sit down. Dalton sat, but his hand, Delphine noticed, had gone white-knuckled against the back of the pew in front of him. Whit Purdy went first, his voice shaking at the start and steadying as he went, laying out plain and complete the story of a debt. A man with two names, and a filing deliberately delayed and misplaced. How much? Cole asked him. Gentle, were you paid to look away? $200, Purdy said, and the number landed heavy in the packed room. Against a debt of $300, I owed a man in Denver for a bad investment. He forgave the rest, once the filing went missing to his satisfaction. And do you see the man who arranged that payment anywhere in this room today? Purdy's eyes moved, slow, deliberate, across the pews until they landed on Dalton and stayed. There, right there, he said. Same man who's been calling himself Cyrus Dalton since the day I met him. A gasp moved through the room. Senora Delgado followed, her voice carrying clear and unbroken across the packed pews, describing 2 fires, 2 nights, and boot prints a sheriff had chosen not to follow. My grandson still has the sketch he made of those prints, she said. I have carried it 2 years, waiting for someone willing to look at it properly, Your Honor, Cole said. The defense would like that sketch entered as evidence, alongside a matching print taken from the ground outside Mrs. Voss's barn 2 nights past. Sheriff Combs, sitting stiff and red-faced near the back of the room, said nothing at all, though Delphine saw more than a few heads in the crowd turn toward him, weighing for the first time exactly how much his silence over the years had cost the people he was sworn to protect. Then Sam Riley, brought in under guard, his arm bandaged, his voice low with the particular flatness of a man who had already decided his only path forward, ran through telling every piece of the truth he had. He named Dalton, he named Gantry, he named the barred barn door, and the horse he'd been paid to let burn. Why? Delphine asked him. Quiet, the first and only question she put to him herself. Why my barn? Why me? Riley wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Gantry said the boss wanted you scared enough to sell before this hearing. Said a woman living alone, no family close, wouldn't have it in her to fight much past a second fire. He glanced up, briefly. Something, almost like shame, crossing his face. Didn't figure on you running into a burning barn barefoot to save a horse, ma'am. Didn't figure a lot of things about you right, I expect. A ripple of something moved through the crowd at that, not quite laughter, but close to it, warm and startled. The sound of a room quietly revising its opinion of a woman it had spent 6 weeks whispering about. And then Cole stood and laid Amos Voss's notebook open on the table, in front of the whole watching town, and read aloud, in a steady, carrying voice, the entries about a man asking questions under 2 different names, about water rights, about a widow's fever that had come on suspiciously close behind those questions. We cannot prove, Cole said when he'd finished reading, that Amos Voss's death was anything but the fever the doctor recorded. I want to be plain about that. Because the truth matters more here today than the story that serves us best. A pause, his eyes moving across the room. But we can prove, beyond any honest doubt, that the same pattern circling his widow's land these past 6 weeks was already circling it the winter he died. And we can prove that pattern belongs to a man sitting in this room, whose true name is not Dalton at all, but Sorrel, son of the man who burned my own home to the ground 11 years ago. And killed my infant son in the doing of it. The room went utterly silent. Cyrus Dalton stood up fast, his composure finally cracking wide open. "This is slander, Your Honor. I won't sit here and—" "Sit down, Mr. Sorrel," Cole said, quiet, final. And something in the sound of the true name landing in that packed room seemed to physically push Dalton back down into his seat. "Or stand, if you'd rather, and explain to everyone here exactly why a hired hand under guard just described your man Gantry, paying him to burn a widow's barn with her horse locked inside it." Dalton, Sorrel, said nothing. Judge Kane's hands, Delphine noticed, had gone very still on the table in front of him. "Your Honor," Cole said, turning to face the bench directly. "The court might also wish to explain, for the record, its own connection to the very investment concern that stands to profit from whatever ruling comes down here today. A concern your own brother-in-law sits the board of." He set the telegram down beside the notebook. "This town deserves a judge who answers to the law. Not one who answers to Denver." The murmur that moved through the room this time was not quiet at all. Kane's face had gone the color of old ash. He looked out over the packed pews, at faces he'd have to face again at the Mercantile, at church, at every corner of a small territory, too tightly woven for a ruined reputation to hide in. And something in his composure finally visibly gave way. "The court," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier bloodless certainty, "finds no irregularity in either the Voss or the Cole filings. Both are confirmed, in full, effective immediately. The provisional hold is lifted." He gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady. "This hearing is adjourned." What happened next happened fast, the way the worst and best moments of a life so often did, crowding together too quick for a person to properly feel each one before the next arrived. Sorrel, Dalton no longer, not to anyone in that room, tried to make for the door, and found Boyd Larkin and 2 other Cole hands already standing across it, arms crossed, unmoving. The town's actual sheriff, shamed into action by a room full of witnesses who'd just watched his own failures read aloud from a dead man's notebook, finally did his job and placed the man under arrest for conspiracy and attempted arson. Right there in the aisle of the church, in front of the same congregation that had spent 6 weeks whispering about a widow's supposed sins, instead of asking a single hard question about the man now being led out in irons. As they led him past, Sorrel's eyes found Cole's, and something passed between the 2 men that had nothing to do with the courtroom at all. 11 years of history compressed into a single silent look. "You'll regret this," Sorrel said, low, meant only for Cole. "My father doesn't let go of what he wants. Never has. Neither do I," Cole said. "That's the part your father never accounted for." Delphine watched her husband-to-be stand there, spine straight, jaw set, watching the son of the man who'd burned his whole first life to the ground, finally led away in irons, and she braced herself for grief, or triumph, or some complicated tangle of both. What crossed his face instead was quieter than either, something closer to release. Like a held breath 11 years long, finally allowed to let go. Mrs. Hardy, Delphine noticed, would not meet her eyes at all as the crowd filed out, except she came back. 20 minutes later, after most of the churchyard had cleared, when Delphine was still standing near the steps, catching her breath from the whole enormous weight of the day, finally lifting off her shoulders. Mrs. Hardy came back alone, wringing her gloved hands, her earlier righteousness gone entirely out of her posture. "Mrs. Boss," her voice had none of its old sharpness left in it. "I owe you an apology. I said cruel things, and worse. I believed them faster than I ever bothered to question them because—" She stopped, started again, quieter. "Because it's easier, sometimes, to believe the worst of somebody who already looks different than it is to ask why we're so ready to believe it in the first place." Delphine considered her a long moment. She could have let the woman stand there, uncomfortable, could have made her work harder for it. But she found, watching Mrs. Hardy's genuine, unpolished shame, that she didn't have the appetite for punishment that 6 weeks of whispered cruelty might have earned. "Thank you for saying so," Delphine said. "That's more than most people manage. I'll tell my husband the store's open to you again." "Whenever you please, I'd appreciate that." Delphine allowed herself the smallest smile. "Though I expect I'll be doing most of my trading through the Cole Ranch accounts from here on." Something that might almost been a laugh escaped Mrs. Hardy before she caught it, and she nodded, once, and went on her way. And Delphine stood there, thinking that forgiveness, however slow to arrive, mattered more for the person extending it than the person receiving it. A lesson she suspected she'd be relearning the rest of her life. In this town, and every other one she'd ever have. Cause to walk through, they stood together afterward in the churchyard, in the thin gold light of a late afternoon, the whole ordeal finally, fully behind them. And Delphine felt something in her chest unclench that had been clenched. So long she'd half forgotten what it felt like loosened. "It's over," she said, testing the words, not quite believing them yet. "This piece of it," Cole said. "Sorrel the Elder's still out there, back east, and I expect losing his son to a territorial jail won't sit easy with him. But he's lost his man on the ground, lost his judge. Lost whatever quiet machine he'd built to run this scheme county by county. His eyes found hers, steady, warm, in a way she'd only seen them go a handful of times since the draw. That's enough of a victory to build on. For today, Boyd Larkin came up, grinning wide for the first time in weeks. Whole town's talking different already, ma'am. Heard 3 separate folks say they always knew something was off about that Dalton fella. Funny how quick a story changes once. The truth's finally louder than the lie." "Funny," Delphine agreed, though there wasn't much humor in her voice. Because she understood, watching the crowd disperse, that some of those very same voices had been the loudest whispering the opposite story just 6 weeks before. Forgiveness, she thought, was going to take longer to arrive in this town than justice had. But justice had arrived first, and that at least was something to stand on. That evening, Cole rode out to her place. What was left of it? The barn still a black scar in the yard, though he'd already promised, and she'd already believed him, that a new one would rise in its place before the month was out. And found her sitting on the porch step, in the last of the light, Samson, grazing easy in the corral, behind her. Safe, whole, alive. He didn't sit beside her right away. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in his hands, and something in the careful, deliberate way he held himself told her, before he'd said a single word, that this was not going to be an ordinary evening visit. "Delphine, Nanton. I've spent 11 years building a life I thought I'd have to live alone in. Told myself that was simply the shape my life had taken, and there wasn't any changing it, and I'd made a kind of peace with that shape, hard-won as it was." He took a step closer. "Then a widow rode onto my land looking for a lost horse, and found 3 of mine instead. And somewhere in the space of 6 weeks, I stopped being able to remember what that hard-won peace felt like, because I'd found something better than peace to want. Instead." Delphine stood, slow, the whole considerable height of her rising to meet him, and for once, for the first time in 18 years, standing this tall in front of a man who wasn't looking up at her, like she was something to fear or something to marvel at, but simply someone he loved. She didn't feel the old instinct to shrink down, to apologize for the space she took up in the world. "I don't care about the land," Cole said. "I don't care about the deed, or the fight, or whatever comes next out of Sorrel's family back east. I care about you. I have since you put your bare hand on a terrified horse and sang him quiet." He reached into his coat, drew out something small wrapped in cloth. "Marry me, Delphine. Build whatever comes next of this life alongside me. Instead of each of us building it alone." She unwrapped the cloth with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside sat a ring, simple plain gold, clearly not bought from any fine city jeweler. Hand-shaped, she realized, turning it in the fading light. The band a little wider than most, size generous enough to actually fit a hand like hers. "You had this made," she said, "before tonight. Before you knew what I'd say." I didn't need to know what you'd say, he said, to know what I hoped for. Yes, Delphine said, before he'd even finished the question properly, the word coming up out of her whole and certain and 8 months' worth of grief, finally gently making room. Yes, Nantan. They married 3 weeks later in the same church that had once filled with whispers about her, though this time the whispers that moved through the packed pews were an altogether different kind. Senora Delgado sewed her dress herself, refusing all payment, and Whit Purdy, freed of his debt, freed of his silence, standing straighter than Delphine had ever seen him stand, gave a short, halting toast at the small gathering afterward that ended with more feeling than his stumbling words quite managed to carry on their own. Delphine wore no veil. She had never once in her life been a woman who could hide behind gauze and pretend to be smaller than she was. And she had decided, walking up that aisle on Boyd Larkin's arm, because she had no father left living to give her, that she was done pretending to be anything other than exactly what she'd always been: tall, strong. Finally fully seen, Cole waited for her at the front, and when she reached him, he didn't have to look up very far at all to meet her eyes. And something in that simple, ordinary fact, two people standing close to level, finally, after a whole lifetime of each of them, standing apart from everyone around them, for reasons neither one had chosen, undid her more completely than any vow the preacher read. "You look," he said low, "just for her," while the preacher shuffled his pages and the whole church waited. "Like every good thing I stopped letting myself hope for." "You look," she said back, "like a fan who finally believes he's allowed to keep something." He laughed at that, a real laugh, rare and startled out of him. The kind she'd only heard from him a handful of times in the months since a lost horse had first led her onto his land. And the sound of it carried clear through the church, warm enough that even the preacher smiled before clearing his throat and beginning. They exchanged the plain gold ring first, the one hand shaped to fit her, and then, because Boyd Larkin had quietly arranged it without either of them asking, a second ring for Nantan's hand, wider than most, sized, generous to match hers in spirit if not in size. A small joke between them that made her laugh through the tears. She hadn't quite managed to hold back. When the preacher finally pronounced them married, Nantan Cole reached up for once, instead of merely across, and drew her down just enough to meet her, and kissed her in front of the whole watching congregation, unhurried, unashamed, while Jasper, tied outside the church door because Boyd Larkin hadn't had the heart to leave him behind, let out a long, indignant bray that carried clean through the open windows and set the whole church laughing. They rebuilt the barn together that autumn, and the new one stood taller and stronger than the old one had, built from timber Cole's own men hauled out from the ranch, built to last, built the way everything worth keeping in that hard country eventually had to be built. Deliberate and solid and proof against whatever fire someone might try to set against it next. Samson grew fat and easy in a pasture twice the size of his old one. Jasper, restored fully to health, spent his days trailing after the Cole herd like he'd appointed himself its self-important elder statesman. And nobody, not even the ranch hands, who'd once eyed him with suspicion, had the heart to correct him about it. In the second spring, Delphine found she was carrying a child, and told Nantan in the kitchen, with her hand resting on his wrist, and watched a hard, careful, 11 years guarded man sit slowly on a kitchen stool and put his face in his two large hands. "I'm afraid," he admitted. When he finally looked up, his eyes wet in a way she'd only seen once before, on her own porch, over a small carved box and a story about a wife and son he'd carried alone too long. "I'm afraid too," she said, and laid her hand against his chest, feeling his heart beating steady beneath her palm. "We'll be afraid together. That's different than being afraid alone. I've learned that much these past months, if nothing else." He stood then and wrapped his arms, as far as they'd reach, around the whole considerable width of her, which was not quite all the way, and had never once in 2 years of marriage needed to be, and pressed his face into her shoulder the way a much younger man might, unguarded, unashamed. "If it's a girl," he said, muffled against the collar, "I'd like to give her my mother's name. Winona. If it's a boy," His voice caught, just slightly, on the old grief that would likely never fully leave him, only ever soften. If it's a boy, I don't know yet. I haven't let myself think that far in a long while. Whichever it is, Delphine said they'll grow up knowing exactly how hard won they were. I think that's worth more than any name we give them. The baby came that autumn. A girl, healthy, loud, with her father's dark hair and her mother's considerable height already showing itself in the long, sturdy shape of her tiny frame. They named her Winona, after Cole's own mother, and on the evenings when the work was done, and the light went long and gold across the pasture, Delphine would carry her out to the porch and sit in the chair Nanton had built for her. Wider than most, sturdier than most, made to fit a woman who'd spent a lifetime folding herself into furniture built for people half her size, until finally, in this one particular chair, she didn't have to fold herself into anything at all. Senora Delgado came to see the baby within the week, bringing a small woven blanket she'd made herself, and held Winona a long while in her thin, capable arms, murmuring something soft in Spanish that Delphine didn't fully catch, but understood anyway by the tenderness in the old woman's face. Whit Purdy sent a card, awkward and formal, signed simply your friend W. Purdy, which Delphine kept tucked into the same family Bible where Amos's deed had once waited, folded soft at the creases, for a danger nobody had yet known enough to name. One evening, with the baby asleep and the horses coming in against a sky gone the color of burnished copper, Delphine walked out to the corral rail where Nanton stood, watching the herd settle, and leaned her considerable frame against his shoulder. Breathe, and he put his arm around her without needing to look, the way a person did once they'd learned a shape well enough to find it in the dark. Do you ever think about it? She asked. How it started. Every day his voice had gone soft, easy, the old guardedness long since worn away by 2 years of steady, ordinary happiness, a lost horse, 3 wounded ones, a widow who wasn't afraid of a rifle, and a rancher who wasn't afraid of her size, and a fire that finally burned out the last of what should have been buried 11 years before it was. That, too, he pressed his lips, briefly, to the top of her head, having to rise only slightly on his toes to manage it. Close enough now that the old careful distance between them had long since closed to nothing at all. I went out that day looking for a reason to keep believing the fight was worth fighting alone. Instead, I found somebody worth fighting it beside. Somewhere in the house behind them, the baby made a small, soft sound and settled back into sleep. Jasper lifted his head over the corral rail and blew warm, grass-scented breath into Delphine's hair, the same way he'd done that very first afternoon in a stranger's draw, as if to say, once again in his own foolish, patient way, "You took your time, woman. But you got there." She put her hand against his nose. She did not let go of her husband, and the wind came up over the wide gold prairie, the way it always did, the way it had the whole length of her life. Except this time, standing here, it didn't feel like something she had to brace herself against. It felt, for the first time, in longer than she could rightly remember, like coming home.